Hi there, thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a comment if you enjoy these Christian romance stories. Hearts at War. Book 3 in the Mountain Promise series. By Mallory Ford. Chapter 1. That's it, Kayla Mitchell said as she stuck her arms in the air like a referee signaling a touchdown. A little further, Lauren. You've almost got him. You'd think she was a mother teaching her child to walk for the first time with as proud as she was at the sight of Lauren Rafferty flipping a Montana Valley Women's Shelter security guard on his back with strength and confidence. The harsh lights of the school gym illuminated the woman's own pride, as well as the sweat dripping down her forehead as Jefferson hit the ground. I did it. Jefferson held up a finger as Kayla reached down to help him up. One sec, he wheezed, though his own pride in Lauren's accomplishment was clear. Kayla had been volunteering with the women's shelter for years with her friend Harper, but she'd left her job as a hospital social worker that winter in favor of full-time employment at the women's shelter. Ever since, she'd been able to add self-defense classes to the group and individual counseling sessions she'd already been offering. The counseling was a vital part to the organization, and the Lord had blessed it immensely. There was something about watching a woman come into her own strength and realize she wasn't as weak as she'd thought that Kayla loved. Finding their strength, it was a beauty to witness. Kayla had picked up boxing and martial arts during her own low point, the moment she'd felt the weakest in her life, and it had brought her out of a deep, dark place. Lauren, that was amazing. Take a quick water break, then come back out and do today's cool down. The mother of 3 boys who'd shown up at the shelter a year before walked with her shoulders back and head held high, the sight alone worth more than any salary Kayla could ever hope to earn. Jefferson stood to his feet, watching her as well. His thick beard sparkled with sweat and his broad shoulders heaving with exertion as he watched Lauren take a sip from her water bottle. I can't believe how far she's come in the last few months. There was more there, that much Kayla knew without asking, but they'd share if either one of them felt the need. She's worked so hard, Kayla replied. Thanks again for being our sacrificial lamb today. I hope Rhonda gave you the day off tomorrow to recuperate. Jefferson shrugged, always uncomfortable with praise. Part of the job. I'm happy to help. The sound of another body hitting the mat pulled Kayla's attention to where Keely, the mother of twin girls, Gracie and Ella, who'd been at the shelter almost as long as Lauren, lay on the ground laughing. She'd been sparring with Hannah Todd, wife of Sheriff Jace Todd and baker extraordinaire. I'm fine, Keely yelled as she got control of herself. I got a little overzealous with the kick and got off balance. Her wheezing laughter was matched only by Hannah's snorts, sending them both into further giggles. The women's self-defense classes had started as something for the women at the shelter, but once some of the women at church had found out about them, they'd begged Kayla to offer them to the community at large. Hannah Todd was the first of 2 newlyweds who'd been regular attendees, as was Sarah Kane, wife to Dr. Micah Kane and sister-in-law to Felicity. Felicity taught at the high school, and she and Robert Gunn had rekindled their friendship from years gone by, and it had blossomed into so much more. They'd be getting married in a little over a month, and Kayla couldn't wait. Weddings were a favorite of hers, a time to let go of the past and focus on the promise of the future. Maybe it was sappy, maybe it was the romantic in her, but weddings held so much hope. In fact, as Kayla's friend Harper barely missed planting a boxing glove into Felicity's cheek, it was the wedding that had Kayla stepping in. Hey, ladies, I love the effort here, but I'd rather it not be said we broke the bride's nose 6 weeks before her big day. Felicity's daughter, Annie, had turned 5 a few months before, and her unicorn princess party had been the stuff of legends. Between the pink, purple, and white balloon arch, the bouncy castle the adults had definitely overshot the weight limit on, and the hot pink cupcakes, everyone went home with tummy aches and hearts full of joy. Sorry, Harper said with a guilty grin. Got carried away. The rest of the group disbanded and went to fill their water bottles before moving through the cool-down exercises Kayla had written on the board. Times they were all together were virtually the only time their group text didn't alert frequently. Kayla didn't always respond, still a little unsure of her place with the group of women who all seemed so secure in their role in one another's lives. Still, as Harper had grown closer to all of them, she'd pulled Kayla right along with her. Hannah, Sarah, and Felicity had all been nothing but kind and welcoming to them both, drawing them both in as though they'd always been there. Jefferson, for his part, rolled out his shoulders next to her in what she was sure was an attempt to be able to move the next day. What's it feel like to be back in your old stomping grounds? I bet it's surreal every time you come here for class. Her happy mood from moments before plummeted, the memories in those very hallways crashing down like an avalanche barreling down the mountains above town. It was spring, mid-March as the snow began melting and the sun warmed the air, but preparing for the mental barrage of memories had her lungs tightening the same way. High school wasn't the best time for me. Jefferson didn't ask her to elaborate, but she wouldn't have had time to anyway. The school had allowed them to use the gym that morning, as Principal Templeton no doubt still felt a little guilty about what had happened to her all those years ago. He didn't need to, he'd never been the one at fault, but they'd all downplayed what was happening. It wasn't Templeton who opened the heavy blue doors and propped them open as he stepped inside. No, it was the assistant principal, Chris Poplar, the man who always seemed to be around no matter how much she tried to avoid him. After all, it was Chris who was responsible for so much of her high school pain. Chris wore his casual jeans, boots, and t-shirt that morning, but it didn't stop him from looking far more handsome than any man had a right to. He had the cowboy look down in his current getup, but she knew from experience his dress clothes created an equally striking figure. Even in high school, back when they'd sat together in the library and Kayla tutored him in chemistry, her pulse quicked at his approach. Back then, it had been a crush. Now, it was mostly pure disdain bubbling under the surface. Every single woman in the room at least turned her head, watching him as he crossed the basketball court and headed their way. His dark hair, cut close to his tan skin from his time spent in the sun, also peppered his strong jawline as though he'd simply forgotten to shave. He was normally clean-shaven, at least during the school year, but he often sported a little growth on the school breaks. He'd been like that since high school, his entire being exuding strength and masculinity. At least, it had until she realized what a coward he really was. Kayla hated that she noticed all the small details about him, but notice she did. "Mr. Poplar, have we run over?" She didn't intentionally hiss as she spoke, but Chris Poplar brought out the worst in her. Jefferson raised a brow at her, no doubt curious about the venom in her voice, but he didn't comment. Chris didn't even bat an eye at her tone, nor at her use of his family name as though she hadn't known the man since elementary school. It had been a long time since she'd felt any sort of friendliness towards him. "Nope, came to see if y'all needed help rolling up the mats. The cheer coach will have my hide if they're not done right, so I figure this way I can tell her I saw to it myself." He grinned, like he'd chosen to ignore her. That was fine, it was what he did back then too. "We're wrapping up." With that, Kayla turned and finished leading the rest of the women through their cool downs, praising them all for at least one thing they'd done that day. If only Chris would leave and come back right when they were finished. His very presence made her skin crawl, and her teeth would be sore if she clenched her jaw any harder. By the time they finished and had the mats put away, Kayla thought she had enough adrenaline pumping to run a marathon, so her plan to run home from class that day felt even better than it had that morning. It was Sarah who'd run with her, as their houses were on the same street, the woman far more fit with her propensity for trail running and ultramarathons than Kayla could ever hope to be. Still, she was the perfect running buddy when she needed one, content to either talk or run in silence. "Hey," Sarah said as she took one last sip of her water before tossing the bottle in the recycling bin. "Is everything okay?" As soon as Chris walked in, it was like someone kicked your puppy. "I was wondering the same thing," Harper said as she approached with a towel wrapped around her neck. Using it to wipe the sweat off her face, she raised a brow at Kayla. "What happened between you two? You're the only person in town who can't stand him, but you're certainly committed to the bit." "It's not a bit," Kayla groaned as Felicity rounded out their group. "I've known him since we were kids, and there's a lot of history there." Felicity and Sarah had both gone to high school in Reindeer Pass, but they were younger than Kayla and Chris, the two of them having been in the same grade. Neither them nor Robert and Micah likely had any idea what had gone down nearly 2 decades before. Micah was 2 grades below Kayla, as was Jace, but they'd have been too young to care much about upperclassmen drama. It felt a little silly, carrying it with her all that time, but that was the thing about trauma. Sometimes, it held on, and there wasn't enough therapy in the world to make it completely release its grips. The Lord alone had brought her out of the pit that had threatened to swallow her back then, but she'd spend the rest of her life pursuing full healing. "We get it," Hannah said from behind her as she unwrapped a protein bar and took a bite. "You don't want to talk about it, but we're here if you ever do. I don't have to tell you that bottling things up has been proven to cause emotional dysregulation, mental health difficulties, and even physical consequences over time." She shrugged, taking another bite of the bar. "But you're the therapist." Getting to know these women better since Harper had started dating Cam was a double-edged sword. They were too perceptive, too pushy when it came to bringing her out of her self-imposed exile within the church to avoid seeing Chris as much as possible. Though, now that he'd started doing equine therapy for the women and children at the shelter a few days a month, that became increasingly more difficult. "Look, being a therapist doesn't mean I have my life together. It means I know how to help you get your life together." The rest of the women laughed, but it was Harper who put her arm around Kayla's shoulders. "That you do, ma'am. That you do." Chris pulled out the push broom from the gym closet and began to sweep as the women finished up their class. As he started the long, slow strokes from one end of the gym to the other, he thought about all the things he needed to do to prepare for the week ahead of him. At least the mats were back in the closet in the correct formation, so Mrs. Hudson wouldn't come stomping into his office Monday morning. It had been a week, a long one that left him scratching his head as to why he'd gone into education in the first place. Not really, but between the mayor's sister yelling at him in the parking lot for giving her daughter detention for skipping class and the kid who'd snuck into the teacher workroom and eaten all the teacher appreciation snacks, it had been busy. Honestly, they probably wouldn't have had any idea about the snack thief had he not gorged himself on so many cupcakes that he made himself sick. There were also the funny moments, like the 7th grader who'd put menthol pain cream in his friend's shorts during gym but the unfortunate victim hadn't noticed until his rump started inexplicably burning during English class. He was a dramatic kid to begin with, so shouting, it burns," without actually giving any helpful information to his teacher had made the whole thing far more of a scene than it needed to be. They'd nearly called the paramedics before his friends stopped laughing long enough to tell them what was wrong. Then, there was also the group of football players who decided to snort pixie sticks during class, creating colorful snot and a group trip to the school nurse's office followed by one to see Principal Templeton. Apparently, they'd been watching some sort of boring video about cell reproduction in biology and decided to liven things up. It was something Chris could absolutely see himself and his friends doing in high school, but they'd needed consequences regardless. At least, for the moment, there were only adults using the gym. Presumably, they'd not be snorting any pixie sticks or playing pranks. If they did, it wasn't something he had to punish. Trying to look serious while also holding back laughter was a feat in and of itself, one Chris didn't always have the energy to accomplish. His friend Cam had arrived to pick up Harper, the two of them attached at the hip since they'd started their fake relationship over Thanksgiving. He couldn't blame the guy, though, as Harper's sister had put her in the scope of some bad guys a few months before. He'd probably be a little overprotective too. "Hey, man," Kim said as he crossed the side of the gym. Chris hadn't swept yet. "Need any help?" He wore gym clothes and tennis shoes with the sheen of sweat on his face, so it wouldn't surprise Chris if he'd gone for a run nearby. "Nah, just finishing up here, and I'll head back out to the ranch. I've got a session this afternoon, so I need to get some chores done before he gets here." This one was a former special ops guy who'd recently been medically discharged due to PTSD and a back injury. His superiors had recommended he come to Montana and spend a little time at Copper Canyon, a rehabilitation facility 20 miles down the road from Reindeer Pass. He'd partnered with them to provide equine therapy in the hopes it would help them the way it had him. "How'd the class go?" "Good, I assume. I got here a few minutes ago. I try not to horn in on Kayla's classes any more than I have to," he said with a scoff. "Wouldn't want to get throat punched." Honestly, despite his own martial arts training in the academy and years working as a police officer, he didn't doubt she'd do some damage. "I meant to ask you about that," Kim said as they watched the group of women chatting. "Why does she hate you so much? I know you two went to high school together, but no one can figure out what happened?" "I have no idea. She's hated my guts since I first moved back to town. I have no idea why, but she basically growls at me every time I get near her. I've pretty much started acting like I don't notice. It was the honest truth. After he'd left the NYPD, he'd come home to Reindeer Pass to get his teaching certificate. It was a healing journey of his own, one he had to take before it swallowed him whole. In the years since, he'd spent time as a gym teacher and basketball coach before going back to school to pursue administration. Still, in all that time, Kayla Mitchell had either avoided him like the plague or looked at him like he was the source of all the world's problems. She was warm and friendly with everyone else, giving grace even to the women at the shelter who came with chips on their shoulder. But him. The kid she'd tutored in high school and formed some sort of tenuous friendship with? She was the complete opposite. The fact he had no idea what he'd done was almost as frustrating as the fact he couldn't stop thinking about her. The person she was in front of everyone else was basically his dream girl. She taught Sunday school for the 4- and 5-year-olds every week, spent all her time either volunteering at the shelter or helping out around town, and was beautiful to boot. Her blonde hair and big brown eyes haunted his dreams, but mostly because they were so often searing him with their anger. The door to the gym opened again, but this time it was Jace in his police uniform pushing through. He might be there for his wife Hannah, but something about the set of his shoulders and the purposeful steps he took as he crossed the gym floor had Chris closing the distance between them. "Hey, Jace, what's up?" As he'd figured, Jace shook his head. "Nothing good, I'm afraid. I need to talk to you and Kayla as soon as possible." Chapter 2. Kayla's heart sank at the sight of the mother and 2 children sitting on a bench outside the school's administrative offices. The woman, with her tan skin and curly dark hair, sat with a swelling lip and blood on her gray shirt with tears flowing down her face. A young girl around 10 or 11 sat in her lap with her mother's arms wrapped around her protectively, and a young teenage boy who sat next to them stared at the floor. More than anything, the mother looked exhausted, the fluorescent lighting making the woman's pallor look even more pitiful. The weight of the world clearly rested on her shoulders, and Kayla's heart quickened at the sight of them. "What am I walking into, Jace?" Jace and Kayla's feet squeaked on the linoleum flooring as they closed the distance down the hall between them and the family quickly, but Kayla slowed her step a tad to get as much information as she could. Chris trailed behind them, but she couldn't even pretend she minded at that point. With the age of the children, he might be needed, and her issues with the man would always come second to the work they did. "This is Gloria Santos and her children, Eli and Sophia," Jace said softly. "They live between here and Drummond, but Gloria sought refuge this morning after her husband took things too far. I brought them here first because I knew you were both already on location, and I figured it would be easier on the family to talk to you both at once." His jaw tensed, and he shook his head. He's apparently been knocking her around for years, but he'd never touched the children. Eli stepped in, and that was what she needed to leave. The sight of the family broke Kayla's heart, but she also felt the familiar anger rise up in her at the knowledge of what had put them in that situation. Gloria stroked Sophia's dark hair, and Eli clutched his left elbow stoically. "Has he been arrested?" "Yes, but we don't know yet if the charges will stick. These things are often more complicated than they should be, as you know. He also hasn't had bail revoked yet, but that hearing will take place this week." Jace swallowed as they approached the bench, his tone clearly one of forced lightness. "Gloria, this is the woman I was telling you about. Kayla Mitchell is the social worker and assistant director down at Montana Valley Women's Shelter. Chris Poplar is the assistant principal of the middle and high schools here, and he'll be able to help you get your children enrolled in the event you choose to take advantage of MVWS services." One of the lights flickered overhead, the contrast of the cream-colored floor and dark navy lockers creating a starkness that didn't feel at all comfortable. Then again, Kayla doubted she'd ever feel comfortable in these hallways again, not after what happened. Jace knelt to a squat, not touching any of them, but moving into a submissive position. It was one of the first things Kayla had noticed and appreciated about Jace, his constant desire to ensure victims felt comfortable in his presence. Chris hung back, but even he rounded his shoulders and slouched to appear smaller as he leaned against a set of blue lockers. He couldn't make himself appear much smaller, as the man was over 6 feet and built like the cowboy he was, but the gesture didn't go unnoticed. "We can help, Gloria," Jace said softly. "You don't have to go back." Her broken gaze rose then, meeting Kayla's eyes with her own. My son, Eli, he can come too, right? He's 14, and he's tall, but I won't go anywhere without him. Gloria's voice cracked, but Eli reached over with his good arm and took his mother's hand. You and Sophia go to the shelter, Ma. I'll be fine. I can go stay with Barrett if I need to. Fighting the desire to clutch her heart and hold herself together, Kayla knelt beside Jace. You're all welcome at the shelter. As long as you don't show any violent tendencies and abide by the rules, we'll all get along fine. She stood then, pulling out her phone to text Rhonda. Rhonda Shaw was technically the director of the shelter, but she gave Kayla full judgment on intakes if she wasn't on duty. Let me text Rhonda to have housekeeping ready a room for you three, and we can drive you over in a bit. In the meantime, Chris said from his safe distance away. I can get both kids enrolled for next week. We have spring break coming up soon, but they have a few weeks to get settled in first. He winked, taking a knee as he approached. I'll call the elementary school principal for Sophia, and we can get the enrollment paperwork completed. He eyed where Eli's good arm had returned to clutching his elbow. Have you seen a doctor about that arm? Eli shook his head. It's fine. We don't have health insurance, Gloria said softly. We left before I could even get my wallet. I don't have my own credit cards anyway. A tear rolled down her cheek, and Kayla could see the guilt that threatened to swallow her whole. You didn't do anything wrong, Gloria, Kayla said. We have medical personnel who can come and check both you and Eli out at no charge, and we'll have one of them there today. Harper did a good deal of it, but anything requiring a physician had them calling Micah Kane from the clinic in town. If something needed imaging, he was always kind enough to open their facility after hours so battered women and children didn't have to sit in the waiting room during business hours. You got yourself and your children out safely, that's what matters. Gloria's green eyes met Kayla's again, and she could see the hope there. She didn't believe yet she hadn't failed her children, but she wanted to. The hope would serve her well in the days to come. Broken but hopeful was far better than disassociated and checked out of one's own life. Sometimes, dissociation was the coping mechanism a woman needed in the moment, but it wasn't conducive for healing or the fight needed to pull their life back together. For that, they needed hope in the possibility of a brighter future than the tattered past they left behind. A few hours later, after they'd ridden back to the shelter and gotten Sophia set up in the playroom with some paper and a set of sparkly markers, Micah finished wrapping the large bruise on Eli's left elbow. They sat in Kayla's office, outfitted in calming tones and comfortable furniture thanks to one of Cam's latest donations. After he'd inherited multiple millions from his father upon his death, both Cam and his father's estate had pledged to provide steady streams of income for the church and the shelter for the foreseeable future. Looks good, buddy, Micah said as he stood and backed away from the boy. No breaks, just a deep bruise that will likely be sore for a few days. Are you right or left-handed? Right-handed, Eli grunted. Good, then it won't affect you too much at school. Micah gestured out the window at the basketball court they'd put in the year before, empty at the moment. You can even shoot hoops if you want. I don't think it'll do any damage. For the first time since she'd met him a few hours before, Kayla watched the boy's lips pull into a half smile. He stared out the window at the court too, but a quick glance at his mother had him shaking his head. I don't have time for basketball. I need to get a job to help my mom out. We won't be here forever. The boy's shoulders hunched, the words he spoke far beyond his years, but his posture and the way his eyes kept darting back and forth from Kayla's candy bowl showed exactly how young he really was. It was a common juxtaposition, one that showed itself in many children with traumatic upbringings. Gloria shook her head, her voice strained as she turned in her chair. Eli, that's not your job. You've had to grow up too fast as it is. You'll not be getting a job at 14. He opened his mouth to argue, but Chris, who'd followed them back from the school, spoke up then. Why don't you and I go out to the court and play a game of HORSE while your mom gets all the paperwork here filled out? So long as she's okay with that, of course. He gestured to Gloria, dipping his head in recognition of her role as his mother. Nodding, Gloria placed her hand on Eli's knee. Go, love. Just be careful of your elbow. You're sure? Eli's voice cracked a little, betraying how young he really was. I don't mind staying if you need me. Kayla took a seat behind her desk, pulling an intake folder out of her drawer. We've got her now, Eli. You get to be a kid for a minute. She's always going to need you, but you've got extra help now. She held up her candy bowl with a wink, hoping he'd take more than one. He stared at her for a moment, holding her gaze as he no doubt tried to determine whether she could be trusted. Slowly, his hand reached out to take a piece of chocolate candy, but only a single piece. Okay, I'll be right out there if you need me. He stood and followed Christ through the office door, Gloria staring after him until they heard the external door open and close as well. As the sound of basketballs dribbling on the pavement outside filled the air, Gloria's head fell in her hands as her shoulders shook with silent sobs. Mothers were so strong. They often held themselves together until their children were out of the room, only breaking down when it wouldn't cause them more worry. As she often did, Kayla rounded the desk and pulled her box of tissues towards them. Taking the seat next to Gloria, Kayla placed a gentle hand on the woman's shoulder and simply sat in silence as she cried. Lord, please guide us in how to best care for this family. Gloria, Eli, and Sophia are yours before they're anyone else's. The sight out the window of Chris managing to pull a few more smiles out of Eli tugged at her heart, warring with the Chris she once knew. Had he really changed that much, or was it simply all for show? As she rubbed Gloria's back in the smallest gesture of comfort, Kayla put the thought from her mind to focus on the task at hand. They had a broken woman, a little girl who'd yet to speak since they'd met in the school hallway, and a boy who'd been forced to grow up too fast. That was what mattered, and she could put aside any feelings she had to help them. Did you play basketball at Southside? Chris watched the boy shoot with perfect form despite his bruised elbow, holding his own easily in their game. Eli shrugged, dribbling the ball a few times as he stared at the ground. I did for a while, but I quit in 7th grade. He didn't elaborate, but Chris didn't need the explanation. No doubt, he'd either not wanted to be away from his mother and sister that much or his dad had simply pulled him out. That's tough. If you decide to try out at Reindeer Pass, let me know. I'd be happy to work with you and sharpen your skills a little. From the little Chris had seen, he didn't doubt the kid could make the junior varsity team even without extra practice. At the moment, Coach Brown was doing all he could do to fill out the roster on the JV squad. You know basketball? At least, it was something he could connect with the kid over. Equine therapy was incredibly valuable as a resource, but it wasn't always the proven methods that worked with teenagers. Often, it was just presence and connection in an arena in which they were comfortable. In fact, it was his therapy methods that had initially tipped him off to Kayla's dislike of him, though he should have realized how she'd avoided him before. Sometimes, a body needed a little push to get them over the edge when it came to their fears and breakthroughs. Chris pushed people a step or two further than they thought they could go, and Kayla tended to coddle more than he preferred to. As he thought back to the way she'd offered Eli the candy, the gentle and loving way she'd interacted with all of them, the memory from before Christmas felt all the more baffling. I don't think I can do it, Mr. Poplar, Wilson said as he trembled atop Showman. Showman was the gentlest gelding he'd ever had at the ranch, and there was no piece of Chris that thought he'd give Wilson one lick of trouble. The kid was only 10, but he'd seen more in his short life than anyone should. He'd been made to feel weak, tossed around by his father both physically and verbally for his entire life. Yes, you can, Will. You're stronger than you think you are, and Showman will take care of you. The boy's lower lip shook, and tears welled in his eyes as his mother, Lauren, looked on from the corral's fence. As the first tear spilled over, Kayla flipped open the chain lock on the gate and strode inside like she owned the place. It was cold, barely above freezing despite the noon hour, but it was also Montana. They were all used to living like popsicles from November well into April, and they couldn't stop their lives for a little chill. At least, the ground was free of snow for the moment. He's done, Kayla declared as she came to an abrupt stop next to Chris. It's okay, Will. You don't have to do it. No, he's not, Chris replied. He knew what it was like to feel powerless, but he also knew what it was like to conquer the feeling in ways you didn't think you could. Will's hands may shake, but taking Showman around the corral one time without his holding the lead rope would do wonders for his confidence. He can do this, and he'll be glad he did. Kayla's teeth clenched together so hard Chris was afraid they might crack. She eyed Will astride Showman, clearly debating whether punching Chris would spook the horse. You have 2 more minutes before I pull him off myself. After he's done, I'd like to speak with you privately. She turned on her heel and stomped back through the corral, her long blonde hair sparkling in the sunlight. At least, the disagreement distracted Will, as his eyes were now both dry and wide. I think you're in trouble, Mr. Poplar. I'm pretty sure I am too, but I can handle her. How about this, let's make a deal. You give me 1 minute of all the courage you can muster, and then I'll let you stop if you don't want to continue. All you've got to do is tap your heels on Showman's side, he'll do the rest. The boy didn't know it, but Showman was so well trained he'd take a lap around the ring no matter what Wilson actually did. The effect of building the kid's confidence would be well worth it, even if he did get yelled at by the pretty social worker. I think I can do that. Entire body shaking in fear, Wilson tapped his heels against Showman's flank, and the horse moved in a slow walk to the edge of the corral before settling into a nice pace. Is this it? Wilson's body had stopped shaking, and his hands didn't have quite the same death grip on the leather. Am I doing it? You sure are, buddy. Grin wide, Chris watched Wilson take 3 slow laps around the ring, his own excitement and pride bubbling off him as he watched it grow in the kid. We'll make a cowboy out of you, yet. By the time Wilson had dismounted, Chris dropped to one knee to look him in the eye. I want you to remember how you feel right now, Will. I know what you've been through tried to take your power away, but you just told an animal who weighs nearly 1,000 pounds where to go. You're so much stronger than you think you are, don't forget that. The tears were back as Wilson nodded, but this time they weren't in fear. Thanks, Mr. Poplar. Do I get to come back next week? Soon, it would be too cold and snowy to ride, but they weren't quite there yet. Yeah, buddy, as long as it's okay, with your mom and Miss Mitchell. You can come ride anytime the weather's nice. As Wilson ran off to ask his mother's permission, Chris met Kayla's narrowed eyes. Would she yell at him after even the success of the session, or would she let it go as he'd obviously been right? Their gazes locked for a beat before she turned away, shaking her head with shoulders so stiff it looked as though a coat hanger had been left inside her coat. Now, months later as he and Eli continued their game, the memory of the discussion they'd had later that day gave him equal parts amusement and confusion. She hated him, that much was certain, but he'd yet to figure out why. They'd gone to high school together, but Chris couldn't remember a single conversation between the two of them. Had they ever even been lab partners? He didn't think so. Darren Page, a guy on his basketball team, had mentioned her name a time or two. Had they dated? He'd never cared much for Darren, as the guy had a tendency to take about everything a step too far, but they'd hung out with the other basketball guys on occasion. Surely, she wouldn't hold a teammate against him, would she? Ever since that day out at his ranch, he'd mostly resorted to riling her up on purpose. If she was going to treat him like the villain of her story, the least he could do was get a few laughs out of it. He'd made enough enemies when he'd worked undercover for the agency he certainly didn't need anymore. It had been the Lord alone who'd led him away from that job, to teaching, and eventually to administration. It wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling in a way his job back in New York never could have been. If nothing else, at least he could rest in that. Chapter 3. Chris, Harper said as they all stood around the bonfire at the young professionals' barbecue that evening. Cam told me you used to be some sort of cop, but I'm having trouble figuring out the pipeline from police officer to high school assistant principal. He'd probably gotten fired, if Kayla had to guess. Not that she cared. He'd left town right after high school, not a care in the world about whose lives he'd almost destroyed in the process. She turned her head from the group in an attempt to ignore him as he explained, but there was no denying the prickle of interest she had developed in the last few months. Chris Poplar was an enigma. The man he was now so different from that night after the party at his family's ranch. He'd fooled her once before, and she didn't plan on letting it happen again. It didn't matter how earnest he sounded as he sat back in his folding lawn chair and sipped the soda in his hand. He was still Chris Poplar, and he never so much as acknowledged the hurt he caused. I wasn't your average police officer, he said with a chuckle. When I graduated, I went out to New York to see if I could get into the NYPD Academy. My uncle has been a cop with them for ages, and he figured I could make a go of it if I wanted to. Was this right when you graduated? Harper took a sip of her own drink as she, Cam, Hannah, Jace, Micah, and Sarah all listened intently. Kayla's attempts at looking like she wasn't paying attention were apparently unsuccessful, as Hannah raised a brow in her direction.
Yeah.
I went out there within days. It took a few years, but I ended up working in the narcotics division. Chris paused, and it was the first time Kayla thought she'd ever seen the man look uncertain of anything. I was there for 3 more years before I quit. Curiosity got the better of Kayla, and she sat forward. You always wanted to be a cop. I remember. So why did you quit? He'd done reports on it in high school, and his yearbook write-up had stated he planned to be a detective with the NYPD in 10 years. For a moment he looked at her, but he eventually spoke. I went deep undercover with a drug ring run by a guy named Drake Thorne. He was responsible for more than his share of accidental overdoses and murders. I'd almost broken the case wide open when my partner, the one I'd had since the academy, flipped on us. Seeing the hurt in his eyes, the anger that flashed as well, Kayla had to feel for the guy. He betrayed you? Yep. He blew my cover for the promise of a quick buck, at least that's what the chief told me. He swallowed, his lips set into a thin line. Anyway, let's say the criminals didn't take it well. I couldn't keep going after that, and I ended up out at a facility in Texas for soldiers, first responders, and other men who needed some help for their PTSD. It was a ranch, but the guy who owned it had been captured behind enemy lines in the Middle East. That's where the equine therapy started? Kayla asked quietly. She had to give it to him, he'd certainly turned an awful situation into one with meaning. It was only then Kayla noticed how intently the rest of them were following their conversation. Jace and Hannah sat on a log with her head resting on his shoulder and his arm wrapped around her. Micah and Sarah sat in lawn chairs, but they held hands as their attention bounced between Kayla and Chris. Cam sat on the ground with his back against Harper's legs in her chair, but both of them spoke volumes with the apprehensive looks on their faces. Yep, Chris replied. My parents left me the ranch here when they moved to Florida, so it was a natural fit to start incorporating it with some of our herd. As for the teaching, he said as he glanced at Harper. That part more or less fell into my lap. When I moved here, Principal Templeton was in dire need of a gym teacher and basketball coach, and the school year was about to start. He knew I had a pretty good background in physical fitness, and I'd played ball in high school, so he told me about the provisional teaching certification I could get until I could finish my degree. You were always the big man on campus, Kayla replied. Everyone loved you. The words tasted sour on her lips, as she'd once been one of the many. Chris scoffed, tilting his head to the side as he studied her. Not everyone. I think a lot of folks liked me for the parties I threw out at the ranch. He raised a brow at her, as though he could hear her heart thudding in her chest. Heat moved from the top of her head to the bottom of her toes, and her lungs suddenly felt like they hadn't had air in years. Her skin, fine the moment before, felt too tight for her body as sweat beaded on her forehead. That was back before I knew Jesus, he laughed. I think the entire town came to the one I threw after senior prom. With that, Kayla couldn't sit for one more minute. I have to go. The rest of the group watched her with confusion as she left her chair behind and power walked to her car. She vaguely registered Harper calling after her, but the only thing her body could do in that moment was run. She'd at least made it to her car before the angry tears spilled over, and the shame she hadn't moved past from stupid high school bullying which she'd spent years trying to forget. That night, the worst night of her life, had spurred her into the career she'd chosen and the kind of person she was today. Still, there would never be a moment she could think of it without her whole body flying into panic. Praying the Lord would help her get home without passing out and crashing into a ditch, she turned her air conditioning on full blast despite the chill in the air and did her best to ground herself with deep breathing. What she had now was tools in her arsenal when the darkness threatened, something she'd never had back then. Dude, Cam said as they all stared after Kayla. What in the world happened between you two? Harper returned to her seat after trying and failing to catch her friend, shaking her head as she plopped down. This is the first church gathering I've gotten her to come to in ages. Seriously, what's going on? I genuinely have no idea, Chris said honestly. We went to high school together, but our paths didn't cross often. She tutored me in chemistry at one point even though she was a year younger, and I'm sure we had some classes together. I really don't remember ever talking to her much. I definitely didn't do anything to make her hate me. Kayla had always been wicked smart, and she'd taken a bunch of classes with their grade as a result. In fact, his friendship with her, surface level though it may have been, had always felt like a respite from everyone else who buddied up to him for invites to parties. She'd never cared about them, at least not that he could remember. That knowledge tore at his gut. Kayla was warm and kind to everyone else. She was a mama bear to the women and children at the shelter, wise counselor to her friends and clients, and even funny when she wanted to be. She taught those women self-defense and mental health coping techniques like it was her greatest passion, but why did she have such a strong reaction to him? Hannah stared after her, the brilliant baker with an eidetic memory who'd come to town on a whim and won the heart of everyone, her husband Jace included. You mentioning the parties at your ranch seemed to be the trigger for her panic. Did she ever attend those? Thinking back, Chris genuinely couldn't remember. She might have come to one or two, but I doubt she was at many. Honestly, the whole school seemed to go to those things. She might have been there, and I didn't notice. Micah and Jace were freshmen when he was a senior and Kayla was a junior, but both of them nodded nonetheless. We snuck into a few, Micah said with a grin. There were hundreds of people there sometimes, and I genuinely don't know how the cops never got called. Jace shook his head. I can answer that. The chief at the time wasn't big on interfering unless he had to. The less work, the better, was his unofficial motto. He rolled his eyes. Your ranch is far enough outside of town it didn't disturb anyone, and your parents didn't seem to care. They didn't, Chris said as he stood to his feet. I doubt they even noticed. I wonder how that's possible, but if they did they didn't care. There was no way he'd let any children he ever had do half the stuff they let him do, but he'd somehow made it out alive. I have no clue what I did to make her hate me so much, but I'm about to find out. Chapter 4. Kayla allowed every bit of anger to flow from her mind and heart to her fists and feet as she wailed on the heavy bag she'd hung in her garage years before. It, along with a weight set, treadmill, and other kickboxing equipment, had been the outlet for her frustration and pain for the last decade. Her hand smarted as she landed another punch, but it didn't slow her down a bit. The cool air outside couldn't even begin to calm her racing heart despite the open garage door, and she probably could have had a full audience without noticing. In fact, it was only when Chris spoke that she even realized he'd been watching her. Who are you fighting so hard, Blondie? Kayla froze for a moment before turning her head at the man whose face she'd been imagining on the bag as she fought. It wasn't the most Christian thing to do, but she figured it had to be better than actually punching the man in the nose. Anyone who has ever made me feel weak. Glare pinning him there, Chris stuck his hands in his jean pockets as he shrugged his shoulders forward. Recognizing the submissive stance for what it was didn't help Kayla at all as she waited for him to respond. What did I do to make you hate me so much? How dare he act like he didn't know? Or maybe her greatest humiliation and pain was so inconsequential to him he didn't even remember. Honestly, she wasn't sure what she'd prefer. Are you kidding me? Chris broke from his position as Kayla ripped her boxing gloves from her hands. Humor me, please. Tell me whatever I did to make you snarl at me every time you see me when you treat others with such compassion. Please. It sounded like a genuine plea from a man who actually cared. Had he really forgotten? Had he gotten a head injury during his job as a police officer to make him forget? Tired, bone-tired from the heat of her anger, Kayla surrendered. You really don't remember what happened at that party after prom? I remember I had one, and I remember Darren turned it into a much bigger deal than it was supposed to be. That's it. Tell me, did I do something to you at that party? Did I say something? Slowly striding forward, Kayla allowed the memories she'd done her best to repress to crash onto her mind and body like the waves of an ocean before a storm. Fine, you need me to jog your memory? I can do that. 16-year-old Kayla stepped out of her friend Jenny's car as her heart thudded wildly in her chest. I really don't know if we should be here. Come on, Kay. Chris invited you. He wouldn't have done that if he didn't want you here. I'm the one who's crashing, and you don't see me sweating about it. Besides, there are 100 people here. You probably won't even see him. That much was true, but it wasn't Chris she was concerned about. It was Darren Page and his other buddies. They all played basketball with Chris, but she didn't see him hanging out with them often at school. Still, they were always at his parties, and they'd probably be at this one too. I really don't want to see Darren. Jenny scowled, well aware of how the jerks had made her life miserable over the last year. Not only did they mess with Kayla every time they saw her and spread rumors about her being far more experienced than she actually was, but they'd also started mooing at her any time they saw her. Never before had she believed she was fat, but this year, it had changed a lot of things. I'll kick him in the shins if we do, Jenny said confidently. But again, there's over 100 people here. Just keep an eye out and duck if you see them coming. The first hour of the party was fine. Jenny was right, they'd barely seen Darren, and he'd been drinking already when they did. Even now, as they stood next to the bonfire in an attempt to keep warm, Darren downed his second cup of what she had to assume was watered-down beer. How do the cops not break up these parties? Kayla asked. Neither Jenny nor Kayla were interested in drinking, partially because the stuff in the keg smelled disgusting. Jenny shrugged, chuckling as Darren's friends attempted to push him into a keg stand. Before she could respond, it was Chris's voice from behind Kayla that pulled her attention. Your guess is as good as mine, he said as he stuffed his hands in his pockets. I also can't believe my parents don't break these things up. He looked tired, but still sent butterflies through her stomach every time she saw him. They'd barely spoken the whole school year, not since she'd tutored him for chemistry finals the year before and again when they'd ended up running errands for teachers that day at the same time. It was then he told her about the party, not that she hadn't already heard. Chris's parties were legendary, and the after-prom one was supposed to be one to top them all. Kayla tilted her head, noticing how uncomfortable he looked in this setting. Why do you throw them? She'd never been able to reconcile the sweet and somewhat quiet guy she'd tutored with the harbinger of rager she always heard about. Doesn't really seem like you. I threw one in the 10th grade, and ever since then it's like people expect it. Chris shook his head, his brown hair cut short recently after 4 years of the longer one all the other boys had. It made him look older, like a man instead of a kid about to graduate. Honestly, I'll be glad to pass the torch after graduation. Anyway, I'm glad you came tonight. Hope you have fun. He rolled his eyes at Darren and his friends before moving their direction. It wasn't until a couple of hours later she saw him again, but this time it was only from a distance. Jenny and Kayla had both grabbed a bag of chips from Jenny's car in between dancing to the thumping music, but the smell of beer in the air and Darren's annoying voice cut through any fun she was having. There you are, Mitchell, Darren slurred as he threw an arm around Kayla's shoulder. Ola Chrissy over there sent me to look for you. He wants you to meet him down by the pond. His friends, Kyle and Leo, stood behind him, both as sloshed as Darren. Still, they nodded enthusiastically from his flanks. Why would I believe that? Why wouldn't he come ask her himself? The idea Chris would want to meet her down by the pond sent nerves skittering through her, but this was Darren. There was no way he wasn't messing with her. Don't believe me, check your phone. Fully expecting there to be nothing but possibly a "when are you coming home" text from her mom, Kayla was surprised to see Chris's name pop up. Chris, hey, I wanted to talk to you about something. I'll be down by the pond if you're interested. All three of the guys wore Cheshire Cat grins, and Darren pointed to Chris's retreating back where he walked in the direction of the pond near his house. It would be a gorgeous night despite the chill, and she had to admit she was grateful they'd at least stopped to change out of their dresses and into jeans, boots, and coats. Go on, girl, Jenny said with her own smile. He texted you. Go see what he wants. The war between the suspicion and the hope raged, but hope won out as she made her way towards the pond. It was the last moment of purely naive hope she'd ever have, but at the time, she had no way of knowing it. Chris looked pained, shaking his head. I didn't send that text, Kayla. What did Darren do? His words crashed into her like a semi-truck. You didn't send it? How? I lost my phone that night, he said through obvious strain. I actually had to get a new one. What happened down at the pond? Chris felt like his heart was about to be ripped out and stomped on, but there wasn't a thing he could do about it. Darren was a jerk, so were Kyle and Leo. He'd not spoken to them since graduation, and the only reason he'd hung out with them in the first place was some misplaced team loyalty. What happened down at the pond? He had to know, even if the knowledge would send his blood boiling. Kayla's mouth opened wide, and he could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she debated whether or not to believe him. I went down there and looked for you, but Darren and his friends popped out from behind a tree and threw buckets of manure on me. Her voice broke, and Chris was certain if Darren was present he'd lay him out. They tossed buckets and buckets of the stuff on me, mooing at me the whole time as a bunch of people from the party showed up to watch. Tears poured down her cheeks then. When they finished, Darren said I needed a bath, so they threw me in the pond. How in the world had he not heard about this? Actually, that part wasn't so hard to believe. They'd only had a couple of weeks left of school after that night, and he didn't have any sort of social media. Not to mention, he'd gotten an awful case of the flu the week after prom and more or less stayed in bed for a week. By the time he'd gone back the week before they let out for summer, the gossip mill had probably moved on to something else. Not that he would have noticed if it hadn't. Mostly, he'd spent any spare time he had training to get into the NYPD Academy. It wouldn't surprise him if Darren had intentionally not told him about it, plus he didn't have a phone until his parents gave him a new one before he moved. Kayla, I'm Dash. No, she said as she put a hand in the air. I don't believe for a second you didn't know about it. The whole school mooed at me for the next week. They all blew up my phone with pictures of cows, and videos of it went around everywhere. She let out a sob, but when he took a step towards her, she backed up. There's no way. You know what happened as a result of that? I developed an eating disorder and started cutting myself. If it was possible to feel a heartbreaking, he did. There was physical pain as he struggled to speak. ID dash. She shook her head again, cutting him off for the last time. You don't know what it feels like to feel weak, Chris, but I do. That stunt sent me into a spiral of depression, an eating disorder, and self-harm that about did me in. Without my parents forcing me into treatment and letting me homeschool my senior year, there's no way I'd still be here. All that was bad enough, but what you guys did in the weeks after. That was evil. It was all too much, but something she'd said struck a chord with him. I do know what it's like to feel weak. The days after he'd been betrayed by Julius, when Drake and his cronies had held him hostage in one of their warehouses, he'd never felt so weak in his life. At least, until all that was over and he found himself in the throes of PTSD. That part, feeling like his mind was his greatest enemy, was enough to drive anyone to the brink. Kayla scoffed, her eyes red and swollen as she backed towards the door into her house. Sure you do, Chris. Do me a favor, save me the story about not remembering, and don't try to relate. You make yourself look like a liar. With that, she whirled around, stomped into her house, and slammed the door behind her. Chapter 5. The pills in her painkiller bottle rattled as she shook two of them out into her hand. Chasing them with a diet soda probably wasn't the best idea in the world, but she'd need the caffeine to get through the rest of the day without crashing at her desk. Knock knock, Rhonda said from the doorway of Kayla's office. A social worker for many years before taking the job, Rhonda had been the director of the shelter for as long as Kayla had been working there. If there was someone tailor-made for this work, it was Rhonda. Do you have a minute to chat about Gloria? Gloria and her children had been there for a week. Eli and Sophia had both had their first few days at school, and so far everything seemed to be running smoothly. Of course. Come on in. Rubbing her eyes, Kayla willed her brain to keep up with the conversation before her. You feeling all right? Rhonda's brow rose, skepticism and concern both clear on her face. Her long black hair was formed into braids, her gorgeous chocolate skin never showing a single wrinkle despite being well into her 50s. If Rhonda had ever had a rough night, it never showed the next morning. I haven't slept well the last few nights. Arguing with Chris after the young professional's bonfire had kicked up her nightmares. It was interesting. She'd never actually been abused, but the humiliation from what the guys did to her and what they'd convinced Susan Portkey to do the week after produced a similar reaction. What do you want to know about Gloria? Rhonda blinked a few times, but thankfully she didn't press the issue. I wanted to see how she's settling in. Since Kayla had been the one to run the intake, Rhonda had let her continue to be the case manager for Gloria and her kids. It allowed continuity of care, as well as comfort for them in an already difficult time. The kids too. Is Wilson in Sophia's grade? He is, and he's been walking her to class for the first few days. It's cute how seriously he's taken his assignment. That kid was about the sweetest thing she'd ever met. Eli seems to be settling in too, but he won't give me more than one-word answers and monosyllabic grunts when I ask. Sounds like my 3 boys, Rhonda chuckled. Have you reached out to Chris about it? I know he's watching out for him at school. I like to stay in the loop. Kayla's belly flipped. She hadn't even looked at Chris since their fight in her garage earlier that week. I haven't. Eyes narrowing on her in that all-knowing mom stare she did, Rhonda sat forward in her chair. Okay, Kayla, I've got a meeting in 20 minutes, so I need you to be honest with me. What's going on between you and Chris? Why do you tense up every time anyone mentions him and avoid him like the plague whenever possible? Help me understand. We have a history from high school and very different therapy methods. Except Chris wasn't even a trained therapist. Sure, he was trained in equine therapy, but was it the same thing? I won't let it affect our work. Taking a piece of hard candy from the bowl on Kayla's desk, Rhonda popped it in her mouth. You don't think there's room for both of your methods for the women and children here? It wasn't an accusation, merely a question. I don't know. I don't think someone who's never felt weak a day in his life should be pushing people past their limits in an attempt to find their strength. He doesn't get it. Rhonda's brow furrowed, and she cocked her head to the side. What do you know about his time in New York? What was it he'd said at the bonfire? I know he was a cop there, working undercover with narcotics until he got exposed and had to quit. Sure, it had to be awful, but he seemed to enjoy his job here out of law enforcement. He didn't quit, Kayla. He was held hostage for nearly a week, beaten and starved all that time. By the time the units got inside to extract him, he had 6 broken bones, and they weren't sure if he'd ever be able to use his shoulder the same way again. Aren't you the true crime podcast junkie? Surely, you heard about that case. I'm taking a break from that stuff for a while since it started giving me anxiety, but I don't think I heard about that one. That's why he left? A few pieces of the puzzle that was Chris Poplar fell into place, but the biggest one was that she'd been dead wrong about him at her house. No one walked out of a situation like that without scars. Yep. Spent months in a facility down in Texas on the department's dime, too. Rhonda stood, shaking her head as she moved towards the door. You're trained not to jump to conclusions about folks, Mitchell. You know better than that. Glancing at the watch on her wrist, Rhonda took a deep breath. You're a good social worker, Kayla. You're an even better Christian, but you're flying blind on this one. I know there's more than you're telling me. It's certainly possible even I'd consider what he did unforgivable, but the man who's been working with our people here. I doubt he's the same one he was in high school. What did that mean for Kayla? I don't know how to get past it. The first step would be to have a full conversation with him and clear the air. Have you done that? Rhonda's expression made it clear she knew the answer. That's what I thought. The good news is I have a meeting this afternoon, so you're the one to drive the van out to the ranch. Barely stifling an inward groan, Kayla nods. I'll do the best I can. That's all I can promise. That's all I can ask. Barry, Chris called after the kid as he made his way out to the school parking lot. Do you have a pass to go out there? The kid was normally a pretty well-behaved country boy, all boots and jeans, and lived a similar life to the one Chris did when he was at home at the ranch. Still, they weren't allowed to go out to their cars during school without express permission from the office, and part of his job was enforcing that rule. Barry shook his head, his bulky frame freezing as the blush of nerves ran up his skin. No, I don't. I have to go out to my car. It's an emergency. Curiosity piqued, Chris raised an eyebrow. What kind of emergency? Barry, the jig is up. You're caught. Tell me what's so important. I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth. He'd done his best to create a rapport with the kids over the years, building relationships with them to make the discipline aspect of his job easier. Kids were way more likely to behave if they knew the people in charge cared about them. Barry clearly debated with himself for a moment before letting out a long sigh. Barbara's in my car. This morning it was cold, but I think it's too hot now in the sunshine for her to stay there without getting dehydrated. Barbara, who? Barry didn't have any siblings named Barbara that Chris knew of. So, who was in his car? It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Barry. You've had some kid named Barbara in your car all day? Or was Barbara like a grandmother? Had some lady been sitting out there alone all day? No, Barry exclaimed. No, not a kid. Well, yes, a kid, but not the kind you're thinking of. Answers, Barry. I need answers, please. Now. Her name is Barbara Streisand. She's a goat kid, and I was supposed to sell her at the 4-H fair this weekend, but I can't do it. Seeing the 6 feet 3 inches and well over 200-pound Barry look so heartsick over a goat had not been on Chris's to-do list that morning. I'm supposed to drop her off in the agriculture department warehouse today, but they'll end up selling her to someone who'll eat her. Or she'll go off, and I'll never see her again. So Barbara's in your car? Chris blinked a couple of times, torn between bursting into laughter and shaking his head. Go get her and bring her to my office. It's already 1 o'clock, so I'll keep her there until you get out today. Barry, don't do this again. His amusement won out as Barry nodded his head rapidly. Yes, sir, Mr. Poplar. Thank you so much. She's really cute, I bet you'll like having her. She better have a cage, because if she eats everything in my office and relieves herself all over the place, you and I might have an issue. The color drained from Barry's face, and Chris had his answer long before he actually gave it. I didn't think about that. So you left a goat with no cage in your car all day? It was only then he burst into the full belly laugh he'd needed since his argument with Kayla in her garage. I'm the least of your worries, buddy. Later that day, Chris knew the tension in his shoulders matched what he saw in Kayla's during Gloria's equine therapy session, but he couldn't make himself relax. It was a beautiful day, the snow had long melted due to the warm afternoon, and blessedly goat-free after the way his day at school had gone. Thank you for looking out for my boy at school, Gloria said as she ran the curry comb down Talon's side. He said you've checked in on him more than once. He's a good kid. I did my best to get him in classes with other good kids, but unfortunately there's only so much I can do when it comes to teenagers and their friendships. With a chuckle, Chris recalled scanning for Eli in the lunchroom that day only to find him sitting with a couple of boys he didn't know that well. At least, if he didn't know them, they probably didn't get in trouble often. With as large as their school was, Chris didn't always have the chance to connect with the kids who kept their noses clean as often as he'd have liked. He's become a different person in the last few years, Gloria said sadly. When my husband's drinking picked up, so did his anger. Eli quit everything he loved to be home and tried to keep his sister and me safe, when really that was my role all along. Chris hadn't heard Kayla approach until she spoke softly from behind them. Gloria, Sophia was asking if she could give a treat to Polar Bear. I told her I'd come ask you. A soft smile spread over the woman's face. Yes, I'll go too and remind her to keep her hand flat so she doesn't get nipped. That was smart, as horses didn't bite often, but when they did, it was enough to startle a young girl. Gloria moved from the barn, holding her head a little higher than when she'd come in. At least, that's what it looked like to Chris. His encouragement quickly soured when he realized he was once again alone with Kayla. Well, I've got to bring the horses in before it gets dark, so dash. Wait, she said as her cheeks pinked in an entirely different way from the beet red she'd turned a few days before. I wanted to, what I mean is, Rhonda told me about your experience with the NYPD. I didn't know what happened to you, and I'm sorry I jumped to conclusions. Whatever my issues with you, no one deserves what you went through. She bit her bottom lip, looking for all the world like she might bolt. Mercy, this woman was pretty. It was an odd thought to have when he was still so frustrated with her, but have it he did. Can we discuss what happened in high school? I know you don't believe me, but I genuinely lost my phone and didn't get another one until after I graduated. At that point, I wanted a clean slate, so I only added a few guys from school to my contacts. Plus, I got the flu the week after prom. It had been kind of a fluke thing, but they'd had a random spring flu outbreak in the spring that year. It had even made the news, as it was late enough in the season it was an anomaly. Kayla's mouth fell open, and he noticed her hands trembling before she fisted them at her sides. You really didn't know? The way her voice cracked, it was like her entire life had been upended and flipped on its head. Chris stepped forward, risking bodily harm but pushing the lock of hair that had fallen over her forehead back anyway. No, I really didn't know. Chapter 6. The track Chris's fingers trailed on her skin left a tingling in their wake, but nothing about the interaction made sense. Had she really been so wrong all this time? Conviction pricked at her heart that she'd never prayed about the issue, choosing instead to hold on to the bitterness until it threatened to choke her, but how was this possible? So, Chris said as he dropped his hand. You said they threw cow manure on you and tossed you in the pond. I'm so sorry, Kayla. I don't know if Darren stole my phone or if he found it, but I can promise you I did not send that text message. For the first time, Kayla believed him, and the rest of the story came tumbling out. Suddenly, it didn't matter she had 3 women and their children waiting outside the barn to head back. It didn't matter her humiliation at how she'd acted ever since he'd come back home bubbled below the surface. Some part of her, the part that had developed a crush on the boy she'd tutored in chemistry her junior year, needed him to know. After I got out of the pond, I was sobbing and soaking wet. It was cold, and I needed to change my clothes. I'd ridden with Jenny, but neither of us had anything else in the car. She'd borrowed her brother's car without asking and didn't want him to get in the next morning and smell it, so when Susan Portkey came up and offered some dry ones, we didn't think about it. Susan had been Darren's on-again, off-again girlfriend at the time. If Kayla had thought they were on, she probably would have refused the help, but she didn't. Susan had seemed so earnest, and she'd fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. What did she do? It was his turn to fist his hands, and Kayla could see the lid he barely kept on his temper. She and her friends took pictures of me while I was changing clothes. It hadn't been everything, but they'd basically gotten every angle of her in her bra and panties they possibly could. She'd been shaking so hard from the cold she barely noticed. It was one of those weird May cold snaps, the ones that caused Mother's Day snowstorms this far north. Her teeth had been chattering so hard she hadn't thought to look, and Jenny was disposing of her other ones. Chris's jaw clenched shut, and the vein in his forehead throbbed. She what? Did Darren put her up to this? At the time, I thought you had. His eyes widened, and his previously tense jaw dropped open. Me? Why would you ever think I'd do that to you? Because the next week all those photos got sent in mass texts to everyone in the senior class. Someone had written Kayla Mitchell on the top of them, and what had once been Darren and his friends mooing at me became everyone in your grade and mine. Kayla, I'm so sorry. I still don't get why you'd think it was me who did that. Seeing the tears fill in his own eyes, the vulnerability contrasting so heavily with the rest of his broad build and cowboy swagger, it made the next part even harder to say. Because the pictures went to everyone from your phone. Chris was going to be sick. No, I promise. I lost my phone for the last few weeks of school senior year. His stomach roiled, the familiar heat a telltale sign of exactly what was about to happen. Sprinting as fast as his boots would take him, Chris ripped the lid off of the barn's trash can and emptied the contents of his stomach into the bottom. I would never do that. The words came out muffled, but within seconds her hand was on his back. I believe you, Chris. I know you didn't do it. She'd thought it for so long. She'd thought he invited her to a party only to lure her down to the pond, humiliate her, and then spread pictures of her in her underwear to the entire upper class. What's more, everyone else thought he'd done it too. I can't believe no one called me out on it. I had other friends who weren't jerks like Darren. How come no one said anything? Kayla shrugged. I honestly blocked a lot of that time out, repressed it I guess, but I remember only a couple of people got it from your number specifically. After that, it spread like wildfire from one phone to another. I was too humiliated to tell any teachers, and school let out before anyone could investigate anyway. She handed him a bottle of water from the mini fridge he kept there, her hand soft on his shoulder as he straightened. It was the wild, wild west of phones and social media back then. Now, they took that type of thing very seriously, and there would be tracking available to see who'd initially sent the photo. As she was a minor, they'd have gotten the police involved as well. Back then, there wasn't nearly as much available to do things like that. Downing half the water in one big gulp, Chris took a shuddered breath. Why, you said you ended up in eating disorder treatment after that. He didn't want to hear it, he knew that much, but this was too important to run from. I mean, yeah. I had 2 entire grades calling me a Kayla the last 2 weeks of school, and they mooed at me every time I walked down the hall. At the time, it didn't occur to me to turn off my phone at night, or maybe some sick part of me had to see what they were saying. Anyway, I spiraled into a deep depression. By the end of June, I was cutting myself and binging and purging. The cutting, I think it was about letting out the pain. Or maybe distracting myself from the emotional part of it. As for the purging, it was mostly about control. I had no control over how anyone else saw me, but I had it over my own body. Chris thought he might be sick again, but he forced it back. Pulling Kayla into his arms, he waited for her to pull back. She never did, and he couldn't guess how long they stood there absorbing the pain and torment from each other. If Darren was in the room right now, Chris might end up in jail. Lucky for him, he'd moved to Houston around the time he graduated from college, and he didn't come back to town very often. You finished out your senior year homeschooled? He spoke to the top of her head, tucked as it was under his chin, but he had to know the whole story. Yeah. My parents sent me to a treatment facility in Bozeman when they realized what was going on. They knew it was above their heads, and I needed more focused help. They never did learn about the party or the photos, but they knew something had happened at school. My mom and dad, they're not the bulldog parents who would bang the school door down to get to the bottom of what led up to everything. They're more the you can finish out high school at home if you want, honey parents. So that's what I did. She paused for a moment, letting out a long breath. Once I got back, my dad decided I needed to feel some of my own strength. He signed me up for lessons in mixed martial arts. It was the one bright spot of the whole thing. Running his hand up and down her back, willing himself to loosen his hold on her a little, Chris warred with all the emotions in his head. I don't know what to say. Kayla had been kind to him, tutoring him in chemistry but otherwise never asking anything of him. And yet, for all these years, she thought he'd been the cause of her deepest pain. I honestly don't know how you came back here to practice after college. I don't think I'd have wanted to see this place anywhere but my rearview mirror. He'd certainly done something similar after leaving New York. If he never went back to the city, it would be too soon. Somehow, she'd not only gotten a job working at the local hospital, but she'd also volunteered and later worked at the shelter, which meant she was at the high school relatively often. She was the strongest woman he'd ever met. Realization of how intimate their position was had him dropping his arms and stepping back. He had no business holding her like that, no business holding any woman like that. Not when he never planned to get serious with anyone. Drake Thorne might be behind bars, but his brothers weren't. Anyone in Chris's life could be used as bait or revenge, and that wasn't a risk he was willing to take. This is a lot, he admitted as he stared out the barn door at the 15-passenger van she'd driven out there. The rest of the women and their children moved towards it, and he knew their time was almost up. I want to talk more about all this, but I don't know what to say right now. Can I take you to dinner one night next week after I've had some time to process? Not a date or anything, he clarified, though the words tasted sour on his tongue. Just two old friends clearing the air completely. I want to hear the rest of your story, and I want you to hear mine. He needed to pray God would help him see the situation clearly, as in the moment he wanted to hop on a plane to Houston and plant his fist in Darren's nose. Not to mention, he wanted to track down every single one of their friends from that time and ensure they knew he'd not been the one responsible. He couldn't do that, as it would bring the memories of Kayla's humiliation front and center. As for the woman herself, she didn't speak for a moment, studying him with her big brown eyes. You don't have to do that, Chris. The air is clear. I believe you had nothing to do with it. Her downcast expression turned toward the floor. I'm sorry for how poorly I've treated you without ever giving you a chance to explain, and I'm also sorry for taping a picture of your face on my punching bag. She smirked, and Chris had no doubt that photo would be replaced with Darren's at some point. Whether she'd been attempting to diffuse the situation with humor or not, it worked. Chris barked out a laugh as her surprised gaze flew upward. Kayla Mitchell, you're full of surprises, aren't you? Chapter 7. Serena James, the adorable and spunky college girl who'd been answering the phones and working the desk at the shelter in between classes, stuck her head in Kayla's door. Hey, Kayla, you've got a call from the high school. It's on line 1. As always, her heart sank. They had 9 kids at the high school and middle school right now, and every single one of them had been through trauma that marked you deeply. It wasn't unexpected or uncommon for them to act out, though she always hoped and prayed it was minor rather than something that might get them expelled. The rule for the shelter was any violence, including fights at school, resulted in a 2-strike system. They couldn't have teenage boys solving problems with their fists in a domestic violence shelter. Even if the fight didn't happen on shelter property, they had to hold them accountable. Thankfully, they'd only had one incident in which a young man had done it twice, but he was 17, so they'd managed to convince his mother and 2 younger brothers to stay through the completion of their program while they set him up with a partner organization who was better equipped to help him. He'd willingly gone, and he was now thriving in technical school and learning auto maintenance work. That was before Kayla came on full-time, but she'd been present for a good deal of Rhonda's turmoil over the matter. Obviously, these kids didn't act up for the fun of it. They hurt deeply, and the saying was true. Hurt people hurt people. Often, the girls would act out in different ways, sneaking out with friends or boys to try to gain some semblance of control over their lives. That, or to dull the pain. Boys tried to solve problems with their fists, the natural testosterone they possessed lending itself to more aggression than was healthy for anyone. It was a tightrope to walk in the counseling space, and there were always outliers. Kayla's stomach still dropped every time the school called. Got it, Serena. Thanks. Picking up the phone, Kayla was surprised to see Chris's name on the screen. Her instinct was to tense like she had for years. Old habits died hard, but they'd reached an understanding the week before at the barn. Maybe it wasn't about one of the kids at all? They'd not managed to figure out their dinner yet, but Kayla wasn't keen to rush. It was his idea, he'd take the reins. Chris, what's going on? Hey, Kayla. He sounded tired, upset in a bone-deep way. It's about Eli. I'm going to need both you and Gloria to come down here, but I figured it would be better coming from you than from me. So much for hoping it wasn't one of the kids. Eli was a good kid, playing for hours with his sister while she adjusted to their new living situation. Often, he'd take her outside to the basketball courts and teach her to shoot baskets, but usually she conned him into playing with dolls or coloring in the shelter's well-stocked playroom. Still, the anger she'd sensed the first day she met him simmered below the surface. Uh-oh. What happened? He sighed, and Kayla could picture him with his head in his hands on his desk. First, he promises he didn't have anything to do with this, so we're investigating whether he's been set up. We got a tip from an anonymous source that there was drug dealing going on, and then we found a baggie of marijuana near Eli's gym locker. We've sent it with Jace to be verified, but a teacher said one of her students accused Eli. If her stomach hadn't been roiling before, it sure was now. Oh, Chris. I thought he was settling in so well. He'd certainly seemed happy despite the clear pain. He's been shooting baskets with Wilson most days and playing with Sophia nearly every afternoon after school. It probably felt lame for a teenage boy, but he never complained. Sometimes, when Kayla happened to have a few free minutes to play alongside them, she thought she noticed Eli's normally tense shoulders starting to loosen. It was as though he might actually allow himself to let someone else shoulder the burden for a while. He even took 2 pieces of candy from my jar at our last counseling session. If Chris wondered what she was talking about, he didn't voice it. I'm definitely not convinced it's legit, but we have to look into it. It's something we definitely need to loop Gloria in on as well. I already had to break up one almost fight between him and Connor Gray earlier this week. I'm not sure what it's all about, and since they didn't actually come to blows, I didn't call. Figured I'd give him a break with everything he's been through. Still, I'm afraid he's headed down a bad path, and I'd like to get out ahead of it if we can. Staring at the brightly colored sugary treats in the faux crystal jar on her desk, Kayla blinked away the urge to cry. Her emotions sat closer to the surface than normal ever since she'd finally faced her past to clear the air with Chris. For some reason, the arbitrary litmus test of the candy jar for children who'd been forced to grow up too quickly felt like a kick in the gut. This wasn't about her. It was about Eli, and it was about helping Gloria find her footing as his mother without the fear of his father's wrath. We'll be there soon. Thanks for calling me first, Chris. I know it's probably not your first instinct, but Gloria's barely built back one iota of confidence as a mom. This is really going to rock her. He sighed loudly, and she heard the pop of a soda can opening. That's what I was afraid of. Templeton probably won't like that I called you first, but there are no hard and fast rules against it. She doesn't need a phone call for this, and I can't leave. How had she ever thought Chris could be responsible for everything in high school? Darren had always been a jerk, as had his friends. Chris's assumed betrayal had hurt so much more because they'd actually had some sort of friendship. They never hung out outside of school, but her time tutoring him in chemistry had shown her his heart, his humor, and his intelligence. I get that, and what Templeton doesn't know won't hurt him. I'll go talk to Gloria, and we'll be there soon. Templeton was a complicated man. He loved the school, he worked hard, and she genuinely believed he wanted what was best for the student body. Still, Kayla often wondered if he'd been out of the classroom for so long he could no longer see the individual students as anything more than parts of a whole. Thanks again. With that, she hung up and closed her eyes. Lord, guide my words and actions here. If it's your will, let the school show mercy on Eli if he was indeed involved, and let the truth win out quickly if he wasn't. Help me be an advocate for this kid and his family. Help me seek justice, love mercy, and give me the grace to walk humbly in your will. Amen. With that, she took in a deep breath and pulled her office door open. The shelter had a large main area with a playroom off to the side, and the smaller children who hadn't started school yet often spent time in there during the day. It was bright and colorful, with its multicolored handprints on a cream-colored rug and walls painted 4 different corresponding colors to the prints. The rug itself had been an impulse purchase of Rhonda's, one she almost immediately regretted when the cream background proved almost impossible to keep clean, but they did their best. The train table, dollhouses, building blocks, and gymnastics mats were a main draw for children all the way through elementary school. Cabinets with all sorts of paints, markers, glue, ribbons, and other craft items lined the walls on one side while bookshelves did the same on the other. Bean bags strewn across the floor were often the favorite spot for reading, but often they turned into fodder for pillow fights. Serena was both the front desk worker and the minder of the playroom. Children were free to come down and play, but those under 5 needed supervision. If it got too rowdy, she'd call the mothers down, but her fun-loving personality meant she normally got out the bubble machine and turned up the music for a dance party. There wasn't a kid on earth who could resist either. All the school-aged kids were gone, so it was actually fairly quiet for the moment. Hey, Serena, Kayla said as she approached the desk. Do you know where Gloria is? I think she's on the back porch with Francis, she replied. Do you need me to get her? Serena's hair was a bright shade of pink, perfect for her tiny stature and sunshine personality. She was in school online to be a social worker, but she'd stayed in town to help her mother with her 2 younger siblings. In the process, she'd been able to rack up more observation hours than she'd ever need, learning on the job every day. Serena's family had gone through the shelters program as well, and her father was now in prison where he belonged. Somehow, despite it all, she maintained her sunny disposition and refused to let anything get her down. "No, I'll get her. If I don't text you before school lets out, can you make sure Lauren or Rhonda get Sophia? They're both on her pickup sheet." The elementary school was a different campus, and the moms with elementary-aged kids often helped one another out by running carpools. "You got it." Serena took the note on the legal pad they kept there and sent a compassionate smile her way. "Good luck." With that, Kayla moved in what felt like a death march towards the back porch. How in the world could she communicate this without shattering the tiny bit of confidence Gloria had gained in the 2 weeks she'd been there? Worst case scenario, it would drive her back to her husband who was in jail, but he wouldn't stay there long if she dropped the charges. As Serena said, Francis and Gloria sat on the back porch rocking chairs looking out at the rose garden that ran alongside the basketball court. It was both function and beauty side by side, and the way Francis rubbed her 8-month pregnant belly as they chatted bolstered Kayla a little. She and Harper had been the ones to convince the battered pregnant woman to come to the shelter and get away from her husband, Stuart. He tried to break in at one point a few months before, but Harper had been there and kept him from Francis and her baby. She was truly thriving, pursuing a couple of online classes before attending dental hygienist training in the fall. Being at the shelter, she'd have more childcare than she knew what to do with, and the few hours a day she'd spend in her training program would provide a much-needed respite from diaper changes, bottles, and all-around baby needs. This woman would be fine. Her arm had healed, and her heart was well on its way. As for the woman beside her, whose eyes widened and shoulders drooped the moment she saw Kayla's face, she wasn't so sure. Chris took one last swig of his weird sparkling water thing before tossing the empty can in the trash. Seriously, the thing tasted like someone ate an orange and then sneezed into the can all the orange flavor it actually had. He was trying to drop sodas, knowing they were bad for him, but seriously. This tasted like disappointment. "Eli," he said as he took a sip of regular water to try and wash out the flavor. "Man, I know you've had a hard time lately, but I can't help you if you won't talk to me. The kid who accused you seemed pretty certain, but we don't have any hard proof about you being the one to source the marijuana. Can you at least think of anyone who might have wanted to set you up?" Before he could respond, Kayla and Gloria burst through the door. Gloria had tears in her eyes, and she looked as though all the wind in her had been deflated. Her shoulders hunched over, her normally olive-skinned face pale. "Eli," she said as she knelt to the floor next to his chair. "Are you okay?" Resting her forehead on his arm, Gloria's hands shook a little before Eli clasped them with his own. "I'm fine, Mom." At least, he gave her a full sentence, which is more than he'd given Chris. His voice was gentler with her too, almost like he was the parent in the situation. He was quiet for a moment before grabbing a tissue off Chris's desk and handing it to his mother. "Here, it's really not that big of a deal. I didn't do this, and Mr. Poplar is going to figure it out." "Yep, I am," Chris promised as though he didn't have odds stacked against him. Templeton would have probably suspended the kid already due to the almost fight that week, but Chris had managed to convince him to let him handle it. His boss wasn't a heartless man, but he also had no patience for kids who did nothing but cause trouble. Chris knew a hurting and angry kid when he saw one, but there wasn't a bone in his body that believed Eli had done this. He'd learned to trust his gut in the police force, and that skill came in handy as a school administrator. That wasn't proof, and a kid trying to set up Eli would probably continue to escalate until he got what he wanted. "I'm pretty sure it's Connor, Daniel, or Jackson," Eli said as he slumped in his chair. "Connor hates me because he likes Olivia, and she asked me to the spring dance." Olivia Henderson was a good kid, sweet and smart and never in trouble. There was no way she'd go for Connor despite his position on the football team and apparent big man on campus status. Honestly, Olivia and Eli reminded him of another couple he'd known back in high school, of a punk boy who came into school later and his sunshine best friend he'd fallen in love with almost instantly. Robert Gunn and Felicity Kane had been through the ringer with their romance, as she'd eventually married someone who cheated on her and left her as a single mom to her adorable daughter, Annie, but the guy had really done her a favor. She was now back in town, and Robert and Felicity had picked up where they left off. In fact, they'd be getting married in a few more weeks. Was that what the fight I broke up earlier this week was about? Eli had had his arm up ready to throw the first punch when Chris had stepped in the middle. Had the kid actually made contact, it would have been a whole lot harder to convince Templeton to give him another chance. Gloria's mouth fell open, and her eyes darted from Eli to Chris. Fight? Her hands started shaking again as they wiped the tissue across her cheeks. This time, it was Gloria who noticed before her son, and she stood to her feet and shoved her hands in her pockets. Almost fight, Chris clarified. No disciplinary action was taken because no punches were actually thrown, but I don't like the direction you're going, Eli. It's not your fault if those 3 put a target on your back, and you can bet I'll be talking to all 3 of them. We have to do something different here. I'm investigating the drug accusations, but I have a proposal I'd like to lay on the table. Gloria took a deep breath and walked to one of the other guest chairs in Chris's office. Plopping down into it, she wiped the last of her tears. What's that? Her voice trembled, but he could see the effort it took for her not to crumble. There was a lioness in Gloria Santos, she needed more time to find her. His eyes popped up to meet Kayla's before he continued, her cautious but curious expression enough to convince him to soldier on. They'd not had their dinner yet, and honestly part of it was he knew he'd wish it was more than a clear the air type thing. Sure, it was cowardly, but something about Kayla drew him towards her in a way even her hatred of him hadn't been able to dim. Spring break starts on Monday, and I want to propose Eli spends it out at the ranch helping me with the grunt work in between equine therapy sessions. I've got a full roster next week, both of women and children from the shelter and guys from the Veterans and First Responders program in the city. I'll need extra help in between to make sure all the horses get the care they need. His attention went to Eli then. This isn't a punishment, Eli. It's a chance. Kids who are dog-tired from working horses all day don't get into trouble. Kids who spent time at equine therapy centers often found healthy outlets for their anger and pain. He didn't add that, but Kayla knew it good and well from her soft smile. I'll pay you a fair wage as long as your mother gives permission for you to come to work, and we can arrange transportation to and from the shelter. He'll be safe, right? Gloria asked tentatively. These men who come from the program, they're not. He will be perfectly safe. He probably won't even interact with them much, as he'll be mucking out stalls and brushing down horses while I'm working with them, but I promise he'll never be far from me. Not only did he need the physical labor, he also needed a positive male role model who showed him how to be the man he was born to be. As much as possible, Chris would also try to bring up faith conversations if Eli seemed open to it. He didn't know much about their religious affiliation, but he couldn't blame the kid if God fell into his angry at the world mindset. Gloria bit her bottom lip before eyeing her son. He nodded briskly, but he allowed her the chance to accept on his behalf. The dynamic was odd, but it wasn't uncommon for situations like theirs. Yes, he'll do it. Chapter 8. Kayla leaned on the bathroom counter of the ski lodge's restaurant with a groan. They hadn't even gotten their food yet, and her date already bored her to tears with his incessant discussion of cryptocurrency, pitched her some life insurance scam he was part of, suggested she go with a salad rather than a burger since summer was coming up, and told the waitress they didn't want the complimentary bread that came with their meal because white flour was basically poison. Something about seed oils too, but she checked out of the conversation by then. Could she walk out? Why in the world had she agreed to this date? Chad was cute, sure, and he was at least as tall as his profile picture on the dating app suggested, but that was where his green flags ended. He'd also called counseling a snowflake's way out, and refused to understand why she didn't aim higher in her career aspirations. Pulling out her phone, Kayla pulled up the group chat Harper had created for a bunch of the girls from church. She didn't participate in it much, as she'd always felt a little like an outsider due to her staunch refusal to attend gatherings where Chris might be. At least until the bonfire when Harper had all but begged. What would life be like now that she and Chris had buried the hatchet? Would she still feel like the third wheel, or would things fall into place more naturally as she spent time with them? She hoped so, but that wasn't the most pressing issue. Kayla, SOS. This one's a dud, guys. What do I do? Hannah, one of us could call the lodge and say your mom's in the hospital? Harper, I could call and say there's something going on at the shelter. What did he do? Kayla, apparently, my round face shape would be so much more attractive if I lost 10 pounds. He offered to train me. Sarah, oh no. He didn't. Does he know you could toss him on his head right here, right now? Felicity, I think you hit all my triggers, sister. Give me 10 minutes to drop Annie off with my parents, and I'll come throw him down. Hannah, slow down, Rocky. She can leave. Felicity, my way's more fun. Hannah, your way is going to get you thrown in jail, and then mine and Jace's lunch date will be ruined. He's getting Thai food. Don't mess that up. Harper, guys, it's fine. I am at the church helping Cam with something, and Chris is here too. He insisted on coming. We're on our way to save you now. Felicity, oh, so they get to go give the guy a piece of their mind but I don't? Sarah, yes, because bailing you out of jail would be expensive, and Hannah has Thai food to enjoy. Hannah, thank you. Kayla's heart thumped in her chest. Chris was coming? Half of her wanted to climb out the window and avoid the whole thing, but the other half wanted to stay and watch the show. It took many years of therapy and positive self-talk, but Kayla no longer felt self-conscious about her body. Sure, she had a round face shape God had given her, and there was nothing she could do about it. She was fit, stronger than she'd ever been, and she liked to eat burgers as often as she ate salads. That meant she'd never have a six-pack, but it also meant she didn't spend her days counting calories and trying to earn her food. The eating disorder had come as a method of coping with an awful time, but at least, it wasn't something she still struggled with. Knowing how hard many of her friends from treatment had to fight to this day in order to keep their demons at bay and their bodies healthy, she felt very blessed in that regard. All mental illness, no matter where it fell on the spectrum, could feel like shackles around your hands and feet, preventing you from moving forward with your life no matter how hard you tried. It was why she'd gone into social work, why she'd spent her whole career helping those who needed it find their strength and learn techniques and tools to keep their heads above water. The longer you treaded water, the stronger you got. Sometimes, it felt like you got tossed a life raft and got out of the water altogether. Other times, you'd tread water for the rest of your life, but at least, you got to see the sunshine. She did her best to throw as many life rafts as she could, no matter what Chad seemed to think about her chosen career choice. Her phone's group chat continued to ping, but she'd been gone long enough. Silencing it and sticking the phone in her pocket, Kayla took a deep breath and opened the door. At least, their food had arrived during her brief reprieve, but the waitress raised her brow at Kayla as she passed. Blink twice if you need help, she whispered. Kayla chuckled, shaking her head. The cavalry's on the way. The waitress grinned and continued moving through the crowded restaurant. At least, the space was beautiful. There was no snow on the ground at the bottom of the mountain, but the big windows in the log cabin-style lodge showed the snow-covered peaks. Pulling out her chair, Kayla took a seat at the table and eyed the Cobb salad Chad had ordered on her behalf before she could even get her order out. It looked fine. She'd had it when she'd come here with Harper, but she'd been allergic to eggs since she was a kid. Chad hadn't even bothered to ask if she had any allergies so they could omit those. Oh well, hopefully Harper would be there soon. As though she'd never even left, Chad started cutting his steak and launched into another riveting conversation about the place of artificial intelligence in the cryptocurrency space. So, what I was saying before is there's this new software, he droned on for what couldn't have been more than 30 seconds but felt like 3 hours before an imposing figure in cowboy boots, jeans, and a button-up flannel shirt appeared beside their table. It was Saturday, which explained why he wasn't at school, but he'd clearly been working on something with Cam since his hair was mussed and his sleeves were rolled up his strong forearms. Oh, hello. Can we help you? A wide grin spread over Chris's face, and he stepped around Kayla to pull out the chair beside her. You sure can. Despite the smile, Chris's eyes blazed with frustration that told him Harper had apparently relayed what she'd told them. You can tell me why you'd ever insult this beautiful woman, and on a date no less. Her cheeks blazed, but she was far too amused to care. Chad stuttered for a moment before his own cheeks grew red. Look, I don't know who you think you are, Dash. I'm Kayla's friend, and I happen to know she's allergic to eggs. Did you order Kayla's food for her? I. That part had Kayla's mouth dropping open. How did you know I was allergic to eggs? It wasn't something she went around discussing, and she could eat them as long as they were baked into something. But hard-boiled like these? She'd be sick in an hour. Senior year, I brought a bag of hard-boiled eggs to our first tutoring session. I was trying to bulk up some before I went to the police academy, and they were my go-to. I offered you one, and you said you were allergic. I started bringing jerky instead. That's right. She'd forgotten all about that. Had she even noticed the food switch in high school? Probably not, if she was honest. He'd offered her jerky every session, and she'd taken a piece or two most days. He didn't think I needed a burger since summer's coming. With that, the fake smile on Chris's face dropped, and he pinned Chad with a glare that had the man shrinking back. No doubt, if he could fall into a hole right then, he would. Chris's voice was low, lethal when he spoke. I think we're done here. You don't call her, don't message her, and pretend you never met her. Got it? Also, word to the wise. If you want to get any second dates, probably remove crypto from your go-to talking points. Pulling a 20 from his wallet, Chris tossed it on the table as he stood. Ready to go, Kayla? Harper figured you wouldn't eat much, so she's calling in a pizza order in the car. Unless you want a burger instead. We can stop on the way back. Kayla grabbed her purse and stood along with him. Pizza sounds great. Chapter 9. Harper leaned forward in their booth at Tony's Pizza, her speech muffled due to her head's position in her hands. I cannot believe he tried to pitch you some life insurance scam. Seriously, Kim said as he plopped another slice of Supreme on his plate. That's the part you can't believe? Chris, I wish you'd have punched the dude. Seriously, who refuses the lodge's bread? That stuff is fresh-baked sourdough, man, pretty sure they're going to have it in heaven. Chris shook his head. He'd been somewhat quiet on the way to get pizza, but he'd livened up since then. Honestly, I knew if I punched him, I'd probably take out more anger on him than I should. He cut his eyes sideways at Kayla where she sat next to him in the booth. He was a jerk, but he didn't deserve to be on the receiving end of all the anger for everything Kayla's been through. Everything he didn't say was clear in the way Chris held her gaze. A million unsaid words passed between them, and for the first time since high school, Kayla realized how safe she felt in his presence. It wasn't even about the physical safety, but emotional safety. That was why it had hurt so much when she thought he'd been responsible for everything Darren and his friends had done. Speaking of which, Harper said with a much more sobered expression. Are you going to tell us how you and Chris suddenly became besties? Her finger bounced between them, pointing out their proximity. When he readied to jump in the car to come help, I had questions, but 3 days ago you'd have stabbed the guy with a fork before you'd have sat next to him in a booth. What changed?
Yeah,
Cam added. Last I checked, you two were mortal enemies. Chris caught Kayla's eye again, gesturing towards her and their friends. The ball was in her court, and it was her choice what to tell. Thankfully, she and Harper were incredibly close. They'd been friends since Harper moved here years before. They'd actually been roommates for a short time after Harper had gotten kicked out of her cottage, though she now had an apartment a little closer to the hospital where she worked. Well, do you remember how I told you about everything that caused me to leave high school and do my senior year online? She told Harper everything, minus the part about Chris, because she didn't want to affect everyone else's view of him. Somehow, despite her deep dislike of the man, she realized now she'd been trying to protect him. Harper's eyes widened. Yes, I remember. Her voice was soft, compassionate, on par with her position as a nurse. Chris and I went to high school together. He was a year older than me, but we were in the same chemistry class my junior year. She means she was a smarty pants and taking a science more advanced than the rest of her grade. Also, she's the reason I got an A in chem. Chris winked at Kayla, his compliment meaning more to her than he could ever know. She could feel the blush rise in her fair cheeks, but she forged on. We were friendly, if not actual friends that year, and Chris invited me to the party he threw at his house after prom. My parents let me go to the party with my friend, Jenny, as a group of us had gone to prom together rather than have dates. Is this one of those legendary parties? Cam still smirked, which told Kayla Harper hadn't told him about her past. She was a good friend, and Kayla had known she'd keep her confidence. Still, it was nice to see. I've heard quite a bit about those. Chris rolled his eyes.
Yeah.
Well, this one went south. Over the next 10 minutes, Kayla told their friends the story of everything from her going down to the pond to meet Chris, to the cow manure, getting thrown in the pond in front of an audience, and then the photos taken of her when she changed. Oh, Kayla, Harper gasped. How awful. Beside her, Cam's tense jaw told her exactly how he felt about the whole thing. So, how does Chris factor in? His fists clenched, and Kayla had no doubt if she said Chris had been the one to send the photos, Cam would drag one of his best friends out of the restaurant by his collar and demand answers. He might be a pastor, but his southern drawl really came out when he was angry. You didn't have anything to do with it, did you? No, Kayla said quickly. I thought he did. Chris, you can tell this part. With a sigh, Chris covered Kayla's hand with his. For some reason, the action was more calming to her than anything else he could have done. She's right. I had nothing to do with it, but at some point that night, my phone was either stolen or I lost it. One of the guys from my basketball team picked it up. Whether it was intentional or a crime of opportunity, I don't know. Still, they sent those photos from my phone to a few different people, including Kayla, and then they started calling her awful names at school. I was out sick with the worst flu I'd ever had in my life the next week, which was also why I left the party early in the first place. I had no idea about any of it until she told me a few days ago. Tears streamed down Harper's cheeks, and she scooted out of her booth to slide into the 3 inches of space next to Kayla. Without asking, Harper wrapped her in a tight hug as Cam sat across from them and shook his head. I'm so sorry that happened to you. I can understand why you hated Chris all this time. I can't believe you never told us, Harper said. For years, I don't know what I thought, to be honest. Picking at a loose thread in her cloth napkin, Kayla shrugged. I guess some part of me always knew I didn't have the whole story, but I didn't want to open those scars again. It may feel silly to some to hold on to something that happened in high school, but it changed me. Absolutely not, Chris said emphatically. One of the reasons I ended up in secondary education is I understand how important those years can be in a person's life. I want to notice kids who are hurting. As much as I'd like to plant my fist in Darren's nose, he grew up with a bully for a father. I remember the guy dragging him off the court in the 4th quarter because he missed 2 free throws in a row. My parents might not have come to my games, but at least, they didn't pull that. Hurt people, right? Cam let out a long breath. I'd like to do the same, but that's part of why I'm a pastor. Brokenness manifests in many different ways, from all different times of life. If we don't surrender it to the Lord and work through ways to cope, it'll eat us alive, and it'll bleed out onto others. He knew it well, if Harper's stories about his father were any indication. Harper moved back to their bench and leaned into the man who'd experienced so much pain throughout his adulthood at the hands of misplaced anger. His father had blamed him for the death of his brother, but thankfully they'd reconciled before his father passed that Christmas. That was how the shelter's budget had grown so healthy and been able to hire both Kayla and Serena to help out with the day-to-day operations. He'd left Cam a healthy inheritance, much of which Cam had turned around and given to the shelter. Their waitress arrived with their checks, and Chris took hers as she reached into her purse for her wallet. I've got this one. You can pay next time. He winked, and Harper's eyes widened again, this time twinkling with mischief. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. Cam paid for his and Harper's before grabbing his keys. Kayla, why don't I drop you off on the way back to the church? That's where Chris and Harper left their cars. Oh, you don't have to do that, Kayla said quickly. My house isn't far from here. I'll walk. It was lunchtime, and after all that pizza, she could use a little movement. You sure? Totally sure. Thanks for lunch, guys. This was way better than the alternative. Despite the humor, there was still a prick of annoyance and self-consciousness that crept in every now and then. Why did she keep attracting duds? Was it the fact she found them on dating apps? Were there no good guys on there? Was it something about her? "I'll walk you," Chris said as he placed his hand on her back. It was his fingertips, but it sent a tingle up her spine nonetheless. "I could use a little exercise, too." Kayla's brow rose. "How are you planning to get your truck?" That's future Chris's problem. With that, he stepped through the door Cam and Harper had passed through and held it for her, looking every bit the powerful cowboy he'd been when he told Chad off earlier. But at the moment, his shoulders were relaxed, and she also saw the carefree young man he'd been in high school. With all he'd been through, she wondered how in the world that could be possible, but for the first time in years, she found she wanted to know. Why had he said he'd walk her home? No, he hadn't offered, he'd basically inserted himself in a stroll through downtown Reindeer Pass to the little white house she'd once shared with Harper. The only reason he knew where she lived was he'd helped Cam move Harper's stuff in and then out again once she found her own apartment. It was on the same street Sarah and Micah lived on, and they had other friends from church there as well. One side looked out over the mountain, while the others backed up to the woods. The little house was small, but it was plenty big for Kayla by herself. Honestly, it hadn't been quite large enough once Harper moved in, but they'd seemed to make the best of it until she'd moved. It wouldn't surprise him if Cam and Harper got married sooner rather than later, but for the moment Harper lived between Reindeer Pass and the hospital where she worked. Kayla hadn't been there either time he'd gone, or maybe she'd hidden when she heard he was coming, but he hadn't seen her. "So," she said as they approached Miss Frances Peabody's antique shop with the ugly gargoyle statues out front. "Are you comfortable talking more about your time in the NYPD?" "Not the end, of course, I'm curious about your life in New York." She shoved her hands in the pockets of her jacket. "It's fine. I've spent a long time coming to terms with it all, and I realized how avoiding the issue was going to tear me apart. There was always a little anxiety that bubbled at the thought of his time with the narcotics division, but it was as much a part of his story as anything else. I actually loved being a police officer for the first few years. I started as a beat cop like everyone else, but I quickly got pulled into higher and higher profile cases." "What did you enjoy about it?" Before he could answer, Miss Frances came out with a feather duster in hand, presumably to dust her gargoyles. Before she began, though, she spotted Chris and glared at him through narrowed eyes. If looks could kill, he'd be long gone. She didn't speak as they passed, but the increased purse of her lips told him she still hadn't forgiven him for the massive manure pile that one of his horses had left in the street in front of her shop at the Christmas parade last year. He'd come back and cleaned it up like he did every year, but it apparently hadn't been soon enough for her. "Still holding a grudge about the present your horse gave her last Christmas, huh?" Kayla whispered, but she was giggling so hard her shoulders shook. "I don't even think she glares that hard at Jace, and she can't stand him. I'm uniquely on her naughty list, possibly on my own list at this point." Chris caught the woman's eye amidst her glare and shot her a wink. She also hated him due to offenses high school kids had possibly committed, as though he could control them outside of school. "At least, I'm unique." Both of them burst into laughter at that, but he could still feel Miss Frances' glare boring into his back. As they passed the bakery and Chris made a mental note to bring Kayla back one morning for brunch, his whole body tensed. He couldn't think that way. The one holdover from his time on the force was that he couldn't have anyone too close to him. A wife and children were off the table, as Drake Thorne and his brothers still undoubtedly held a grudge for his role in their ultimate downfall. "You asked earlier what I enjoyed about it," he said as he worked to control his breathing at the thought of anyone getting hurt because of him. "I have a deep desire for justice being served, but I also realized how much I loved the community programs we ran for at-risk youth. That's how I ended up with my first narcotics case, actually, and how I ultimately got promoted to that division." "Through youth programs?"
Yeah.
"I got word some of the boys in this after-school basketball league we ran were falling in with some bad guys. They were getting exposed to harder and harder stuff. It became important for me to get as much of that off the street as I could, so I dug a little and followed some leads. It was the first arrest that would have gotten him in the news if his bosses had allowed it, but even then they'd wanted him undercover in another part of the city. After that, I worked a few more cases before going undercover. How long were you undercover? Kayla faced him now, her ocean blue eyes both curious and concerned. She was a smart woman, she knew what it meant to be undercover with a drug ring like that. The memory of being pulled into Drake's office at the club, seeing his armed guards flanking him on either side, would haunt him forever if he let it. 6 months before it all went south. Chapter 10. Kayla drove the shelter's van out to Chris's ranch Wednesday with equal parts anticipation at seeing Chris again and a little confusion over how quickly he'd left Saturday. After he mentioned he'd been undercover for 6 months, he'd more or less clammed up and what had previously been casual brushes of his hand on hers turned to him staying a foot apart from her the entire rest of the walk. Even when they'd reached her house, he'd stayed on the sidewalk along the front of the house rather than even step foot on her property. He didn't owe her anything, and he wasn't responsible for the confusing feelings stirring nearly as soon as they'd cleared the air between them, but what had she done wrong? Moo-moom, 10-year-old Brady whined from the back seat of the 15-passenger van. Ben won't stop touching me. In the rearview mirror, Kayla bit her lip to hide her grin at the way Lauren rolled her eyes. Boys, if you don't want to get kicked out of this van and walk the rest of the way to the ranch, I suggest you leave each other alone. Frances giggled next to her, only along for the ride because she enjoyed spending time with the horses and watching everyone else. At some point, when she wasn't 8 months pregnant, they'd see if she wanted to participate in equine therapy, but for now she enjoyed coming along. Often, Kayla could find her in the barn petting the horses and feeding them treats from the bucket Chris kept there. She'd stroke their long faces and whisper to them with a look of utter contentment on her face. Yes, Frances was destined to become a horse girl one day, that much Kayla could take to the bank. Keely sat in the row with Lauren while her 8-year-old twins made friendship bracelets from beads they brought in a sandwich bag. They were quiet for the moment, but they could as easily be the ones fighting on the way home. Brady huffed out a breath and crossed his arms over his chest, staring out the window as his little brother, Ben, wore a Cheshire cat grin and winked when he caught Kayla's eye. That kid was a charmer. At 6 years old, he had the makings of a class clown and full-on ladies' man as long as they could train him to use his powers for good. Wilson, Sophia, and Eli all sat in the front row, but none of them spoke for the moment. Wilson and Sophia both read books, while Eli looked out his own window at the sight of the farmland passing by. It wasn't his first day working for Chris, and she'd agreed to bring him out that morning when they came for their session. Chris would bring him back that afternoon, so they wouldn't have to make a special trip. As for Gloria, perched in the passenger seat next to Kayla, it was clear the woman was already doubting her decision despite the first few days going well. She bit her nails and twirled her hair around her finger, picking at the split ends before returning to her nail biting. "You're sure this is a good idea?" Her voice was quiet, barely above a whisper, but Kayla heard her nonetheless. She hadn't heard any complaints from Eli about the work, but mothers experienced far more than their fair share of guilt. Eli did too, as his eyes immediately darted to his mother's profile, but he didn't speak. The kid had been forced to grow up way too quickly, and it didn't surprise Kayla one bit he'd ended up acting out. "I'm sure. Chris has so much experience in this arena, and it's been good for Eli to get out of the house and among the horses." Hopefully, Eli heard her too. Plus, he's been through some really tough things, but so have all the people who will come to the ranch while he's here. Maybe he won't feel so alone. The kid's expression in the rearview mirror told Kayla he had indeed heard what she said, and his slight nod in acknowledgement, as they turned off the main road and onto the long gravel drive, warmed her. Feeling alone, especially as a 14-year-old kid in the throes of pain adults put on him, was a recipe for disaster. Gloria swallowed as they went over the Colson River Bridge. It was only about 15 feet deep, maybe 20 at the most, but the current could be strong as the snow on the mountains melted. "I hate bridges," she whispered softly. "Is that something you've always felt, or a newer development?" The woman alternated between gripping the door handle and tapping the automatic window button. Her breathing had quickened, and Kayla realized she hadn't noticed on their previous trips out to the ranch how much Gloria disliked the bridge. "It's a fairly common phobia." It wasn't Gloria who spoke next. It was Eli. His voice was soft, and Sophia didn't hear him thanks to her headphones. Dad used to threaten to drive us off bridges if we didn't do what he wanted. The pain and anger in his voice cut straight to Kayla's heart. He said we'd go down as a family, a tragedy no one could have predicted. I don't know if he'd have actually done it, but he threatened it every time we went over one. Eli's jaw clenched in the rearview mirror, and she could all but see the memories plaguing his big brown eyes. The idea of both children terrified in the back seat while their mother tried desperately to keep her husband calm infuriated Kayla, but it also broke her heart. Gutted, Kayla reached over and took Gloria's trembling hand. "Gloria, open the glove box for me." Hands shaking the whole way, Gloria did as she said. What do you need?" "See that little blue multi-tool in there?" She nodded, pulling it from the glove box and turning it over in her hand. "That tip right there will break a car window easily so you and anyone else inside can get out. In the event you can't get your seatbelt undone, that notch right there is a seatbelt cutter." Gloria's eyes widened. "Where can I get one of these?" "My father was big on car safety. We had cold weather kits, food bags, first aid kits, multi-tools, jumper cables, tire changing tools, reflective signs, and flares in every vehicle. I guess some of it stuck, because I outfitted the shelter van with all of it as soon as I got the job. You keep that one, I've got more at my house. Keep it in your purse, then you know you always have a way out." As the van crossed off the bridge and back onto land, Kayla slowed the van before turning onto the ranch's long drive. Sometimes, all people needed to feel safe was a way out. Sometimes, they needed to feel they had some power returned to them. The way Gloria clutched the multi-tool, it was clear she'd had more power taken from her than Kayla could imagine. Little by little, she'd pray God would use her to help give it back. They bumped down the drive, and Kayla's phone started dinging like crazy. It was the notification for their group chat, so she didn't think it was an emergency. When those girls got to talking about something, they could easily leave hundreds of messages for her to read through before she actually responded. Turned out, as she pulled in the parking space in front of the barn and scrolled through her notifications, she was right. "Hannah, what's everyone's assignment for the town service day on Saturday?" "Felicity, I think I'm on Main Street helping pull weeds in the town square." "Sarah, is that right?" Sarah worked part-time as the town events coordinator in addition to her full-time employment with the bakery. It was only a few hours a week most weeks, but she'd been volunteering the same position for a few years, so at least the mayor was finally paying her. "Harper, I'm going with Micah to check in on some of our homebound population before we join Cam at the church for some projects there." "Hannah, I'm with Felicity on Main Street, and I think Jace and Robert are helping some of our widows with their yard work." Kayla groaned as she stepped out onto the dirt path outside the barn and corral. She'd been happy when Sarah had assigned her the high school, knowing Chris was in charge and trying not to think too much about why that made her stomach do flips as though it was a 6-year-old in a gymnastics class. Now, it was like their roles were flipped where Chris was the one avoiding her after she'd spent so long avoiding him. He didn't glare at her. He'd not been rude, but the warmth they'd experienced as they walked home from the pizza parlor was gone. "Sarah, I'm going from place to place to make sure everyone has what they need, but then I'm going to work at the trailheads for a while." "I think Kayla's at the high school." "Kayla, yep. Helping with cleanup there." She'd almost reached the bench outside the barn where she planned to sit and hoped to mostly avoid awkward and confusing interactions with Chris when the man himself emerged from the barn. He wore a plaid button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up his forearms, a signature look that reminded her how strong he actually was. His jeans had worn spots, which came from actual work rather than being made that way, and it was the same for his boots. Today, he wore a baseball cap and sported a little scruff that made him even more handsome, especially at the smile that spread over his face at the sight of Eli. "There's my best employee." "I'm your only employee," Eli said dryly despite the way his shoulders straightened up a little at the compliment. "Still the best. Go on in and see what you can do about Jade's stall while I get started on the lesson. I've got a list on the board for you again today, but let me know if you have any questions." It was only then he noticed Kayla sitting there on the whitewashed wooden bench. He tensed, something she was trained to notice in therapy, and his nonverbal communication screamed his discomfort. Chris ran a hand down his face, pasting on the fakest smile she'd ever seen from the man. "Morning, Kayla. I thought Rhonda was bringing the ladies out today. What in the world had she done so wrong? She got caught up with some paperwork, so I offered. With a curt nod but no further words to her, Chris moved into the lesson corral. All right. Who's up first today? Mr. Poplar, Eli said as he filled his paint roller with the navy paint they were using to cover the graffiti kids had been working on for years. Didn't you coach basketball when you taught here? The kid had been incredibly helpful working at the ranch during his spring break. He arrived as soon as he could possibly get a ride out there, always by 8 o'clock in the morning, and he was happy to work until dinner time. Most days, Chris got him fast food on his way back to the shelter, not his official form of payment, but it might as well have been for a 14-year-old boy. Yep, coached for 5 years before I went into administration. Why do you ask? Eli was quiet for a moment, rolling his brush over the bright orange and purple words that had been spray painted there since Chris was in school. I was thinking of trying out. I know I probably won't be able to play this season because I transferred even if I made it, but I could practice. Chris made a mental note to check with the state's athletic department and see if he could get a waiver due to Eli's unique situation. It wasn't unheard of, but the rule was there to discourage families from moving districts simply for the sake of sports. Your mom said you played basketball when you were younger. Why'd you quit? The kid dipped his brush in the paint again, running it over the faded paint once more. It had needed a touch-up for years, and it had been first on Templeton's list when Sarah reached out about the town cleanup day. Painting had always felt a little therapeutic to him, the repetitive motion comforting in a way. As he dipped his own roller, he waited for Eli to speak. He knew the answer to his question, but it'd be nice to hear it from Eli himself. I needed to get home, I guess. My dad, he got mad if all the chores weren't done before he got home, but I couldn't do it if I had practice. Figured it was worth the trade-off. Fist itching to plant itself in his father's face, Chris shook his head. You're a good son, Eli, and a good brother. I hope you know that. Before he could respond, the sight of Kayla perched on a 20-foot ladder cutting in from the top sent his heart plummeting to the ground. He'd done his best to avoid her after he realized how easy it would be to fall for her, something completely impossible for him to do with things as they stood. Drake Thorne occupied his thoughts weekly, and he still had the occasional nightmares of his time under the man's capture. The physical beatings he'd gone through were nothing compared to the psychological torture he'd endured. Some of it, he knew he'd repressed in an attempt to outrun it, but the body always had a way of bringing those things out. Kayla, he said as he jogged over to her. What are you doing up there? I told all of you to let me and our maintenance staff do the top parts. She looked down, her paint-splattered jeans and an old gray t-shirt had clearly been used for the task before, somehow still beautiful despite their casual nature. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, a thick headband holding flyaways off her face. She scowled at him, not all that different from how she'd looked at him when she still thought him responsible for her high school bullying. I can handle a ladder, Chris. If we can finish this part of the wall, that'll be an entire section they don't have to do later. She was the only one in this area, and he and Eli had been working on the other end. A couple other townsfolk had made good progress in the middle, but none of the rest of them had decided to pull out the ladder. Surely, you and the maintenance staff have better things to do than paint the side of the gym. Besides, it's not like you care anyway. The hurt in her voice, how she could somehow accuse him of ghosting her without even saying it, he could almost feel the crack in his heart. Look honey, we can talk things out. Just come down from there before you fall. That ladder wasn't their sturdiest one, but he'd rather her not be on the ladder in the first place. Especially when there was no one to hold the bottom. She stood still for a few seconds before speaking again. Fine. Have it your way. She may hate him again, but it was a momentary win. At least, it was until she took a step as the ladder's catch mechanism finally gave way and slid down 2 notches. It stopped due to the safety catch, but she didn't as she lost her balance in the fray. Kayla. Within a second, he'd covered the short distance between himself and the ladder. Good thing too, as Kayla's body plummeted towards the grass from far enough up to do some serious damage. Ready to break her fall at any cost, Chris didn't breathe until he'd managed to catch her torso in a cradle milliseconds before disaster, and they both landed hard on the ground. Are you okay? She blinked a few times, clearly getting her bearings after the fall. I think so. Are you? That wasn't exactly a soft landing. He should help her to her feet, should remind himself of the reason they could be nothing more than friends, but he didn't want to. For a few breaths, he wanted to feel what it was like to hold her, even if he looked silly doing it. The rest of the people painting the gym hurried in their direction as Kayla's eyes met his. Neither spoke for a second, but their time rapidly ticked away as Eli and the other two helpers came their way. "Thank you," she said softly. If they'd been alone, there was no doubt in his mind he wouldn't be able to hold back from kissing her. Hurting her, stepping away despite her own decades she spent doing the same, was harder than he'd have thought it would be. Could the Lord really be leading him in this direction? Was he worrying about things that would never come to pass, missing out on the potential of exploring things with Kayla due to fear of Drake Thorne and his brothers? He'd almost convinced himself he was when his phone trilled in his pocket. The others reached them, and Chris placed Kayla gently on her feet. "Let me get this. I'll be right back." Kayla nodded, still a little dazed. He'd be concerned about a concussion if he didn't know she'd not hit her head. Could whiplash cause that? Or was she as mixed up about whatever sparks passed between them as he was? Pulling his phone from his pocket, Chris's blood ran cold at the sight of one of his old coworkers calling. She worked for the FBI now, having been recruited after playing a key role in his rescue. "Hey, Jack, what's up?" Jacqueline Moore was a force of nature when it came to information gathering. She was a whiz with computers, but equally as brilliant with people. She and her husband had both been on the force, though her husband had moved into the private sector from what he'd heard since. If she was calling, it couldn't be good. "Hey, Chris, I'm sorry to bother you, but I've got some news you're going to want to know." Cut to the chase, as always. Drake Thorne's been released due to what we're pretty sure was some bribery or coercion, but released nonetheless. "We don't have any intel that he knows where you are, but it wouldn't hurt to lay low." Any questions he'd had the moment before about being able to pursue a relationship with Kayla flew out the window. There was no way he could even entertain the idea with Drake Thorne released and potentially out for blood. "Thanks, Jack. I appreciate the heads up. You deserve the peaceful life after all you went through. I'm sorry to have to be the one to shake it up. Figured you'd want to know." "I do, thanks. Keep me posted, okay?"
Yeah.
"Of course." Without speaking any further, Jacqueline hung up. There was no telling how many plates she was juggling at the moment, but he appreciated the call nonetheless. Well, appreciate was a strong word, but he was grateful she'd reached out. To think, a few days ago, he'd been trying to keep a goat from eating all the furniture in his office, and today he might be facing down the barrel of a drug lord. The spiral started before he realized it, but at least he had the tools now to recognize it. "Guys," he choked out as the panic threatened to overtake him. "I've got to head up to my office for a minute. I'll be back." If he didn't get away before the shakes and sweating started, there was no way the rest of them wouldn't notice. His heart already thumped in his ears, so fast it was like a hummingbird's wings as they hovered near a feeder. "Lord," he said breathlessly as he all but sprinted to the gym's side door. "Help me." Chapter 11. Kayla watched as Chris bolted through the gym doors, her heart aching at the sight of the anguish on his face. It was one she recognized. Something in that phone call had thrown him for a loop, and there was no way she could leave him to deal with it by himself. She could almost see his pulse picking up, feel the panic in his mind as his brain warred with itself. At the hospital, she'd worked with a number of PTSD patients. They often had other wounds they entered with from car accidents or acts of violence, but it was the panic that had Kayla summoned to rooms often. Sometimes, especially when someone had had a particularly traumatic medical experience, that struggle could rear its head even when they weren't the patient. More than once, female family members of women in labor and delivery stood in the hallway trying to get their breaths in order, fighting to keep memories of their own traumatic births from ruining the day. Other times, parents of children who'd experienced chronic illness struggled to cope with the normal injuries and illnesses of childhood once their kid was finished with their treatment. The way the blood had drained from Chris's face, the way his fight or flight kicked in at the unseen enemy, it was clear as day he'd begun to spiral into the pit. Men, especially men who'd been first responders or military, often hesitated to get the help they needed. They felt the need to hide their weakness, though thankfully he seemed to have plenty of tools at his disposal. Still, there was no way she'd let him muddle through alone if she could help it. He might kick her out of his office, but at least, she'd know she tried. But maybe, if he'd let her, she could actually help. Eli, I'm going to pop inside for a moment. Are you okay, out here? Eli had his eyes fixed on the door Chris had disappeared through, too, his barometer for moods and stress higher than it should ever have to be at his age. Yes, ma'am. Daily, Kayla prayed the Lord would break through Eli's anger and pain to deliver him from all of it. Watching him now, the concern he clearly felt over Chris as she moved forward to squeeze his shoulder, he was on his way. He'll be all right. I'll make sure of it. Eli nodded before picking up the brush again and returning to work. The other people working on the gym had already done so, and Kayla couldn't help but wonder what she'd find as she followed Chris's path through the empty gym and down the hall to the administrative offices. The halls were empty, navy blue lockers and the wolf mural wiped spick and span that morning from the cleanup crew. Windows that had been cleaned of dust and fingerprints let in even more light than usual, creating a cheery atmosphere as her tennis shoes patted down the linoleum floor. At least, it was cheery until she stepped inside the main office and heard the sound of gut-wrenching sobs coming from inside Chris's office. Lord, show me what to do. Guide me in when to speak and when to stay silent. He sniffed, and she could hear him shuffling against some sort of surface. She'd known about his PTSD. It was why he'd started equine therapy in the first place, but what triggered him so quickly? Surely, it wasn't her falling from the ladder. He'd seemed calm, and she hadn't missed the way his eyes had flicked to her lips for a moment before his phone rang. Chris? She knocked on his door and found him in the small cutout under his desk. He'd curled in on himself, sitting as tears streamed down his face and his entire body shook. This normally larger-than-life, steady man was falling apart on the floor of his office. Kayla hurried inside, crouching in the most relaxed position she could muster. She didn't reach in to touch him, as that helped some people suffering from panic attacks, but not others. I'm here. Ride the wave. It'll be over soon. Riding the wave. Remembering the feeling was only for a moment and it would eventually pass. It was one of her main coping strategies she'd learned at the residential center in high school. They'd taught her how to count her breaths, how to do box breathing, and how to ground herself using her 5 senses. She learned more about the neuroscience behind it later while earning her degree, but by then, she'd already seen the techniques work wonders. Chris didn't rock back and forth like some did, but his face showed the mental anguish he felt as his entire body trembled uncontrollably. Didn't W want you to see me L, like this? His teeth chattered despite the sweat that beaded on his forehead. Going purely on instinct, or maybe the guidance of the Holy Spirit, Kayla chuckled. Chris, I've been the sole social worker at a regional hospital and the assistant director at a battered women's shelter. You think a little panic attack scares me? Not a chance, buddy. It's going to take a whole lot worse than this if you want to send me running for the hills. She winked, encouraged by the way her words seemed to slow his trembling. Trying to do the counting thing, but my brain's not working. His words came a little clearer that time, and his color had started to come back. When clients can't do them all, I tell them to focus on things they can feel. Think about the way your body feels the floor beneath you, how your back leans against the wooden desk. Gingerly, she reached out to place her hand on his knee. My hand on your leg, your fingers clenched into your palms. What else do you feel? He took a shuddering breath, nodding as the shaking stopped entirely. I feel my tongue on the roof of my mouth. I feel the cramp in my leg I didn't notice until now from how I'm sitting. I feel my clothes on me and the shoes on my feet. Good. You can keep going if you need to. I can also smell your perfume. He deviated from the exercise. It smells like coconut and vanilla. Reminds me of cookies. With that, he finally took his first clear and deep breath before crawling out from under his desk. Thank you for coming. I would have been fine, but having you here helped. I can't always stop them before they start. That was a hallmark of PTSD. Panic could come out of nowhere, or it could be triggered by something. It was why the 4th of July was often so difficult for soldiers who'd been in combat. Do you know what set it off?
Yeah.
I do. They sat cross-legged on the floor behind his desk, facing each other though not touching at the moment. I got a call that the guy whose drug ring I helped take down, the one who held me captive for 5 days, he's getting out. I've known his brothers were out for a while, but hearing he's getting released too. I don't know. It hit me hard. Chris leaned his head back against the desk, closing his eyes as he took in long, deep breaths. Of course, it did, Kayla said softly. It's your worst nightmare, right?
Yeah.
I wish I could control it better. Usually, I can. I haven't had one like that in years. I wish it hadn't happened in front of you. His eyes widened.
Oh no.
Eli. Did he see it too? A soft voice from outside the office sounded as Eli stepped around the corner.
Yeah.
Mr. Poplar. I did. Miss Kayla told me to stay outside and paint, but I couldn't. You've helped me, he said as he walked around the desk and plopped onto the floor with them. If I can help you, I want to do it. Tears pricked Kayla's eyes at his kindness, but also the fact he was so comfortable playing the grown-up in the room. You're a good egg, Eli Santos. Don't let anyone tell you different. She winked, as both the guys chuckled. Thanks for coming to check on me, bud, Chris said. Part of me wants to be embarrassed, but shame has no place here anymore. He placed his fist on his heart. God's delivered me from it, even though he hasn't delivered me from 100% of my problems. How this man could use one of his darkest moments to share the gospel with a hurting kid was beyond her, but that's who Chris was. He wasn't speaking as the assistant principal or someone connected to the shelter, but a friend who'd gotten to know Eli while the kid worked for him. Honestly, it wouldn't surprise her if he was open about his faith during school hours as well. The more she got to know him, the more she liked. Eli shifted, leaning back against the wall. How can you love a God who would allow all that to happen to you? Chris's brow furrowed, but Eli shrugged. I Googled you once. You said you'd been with the NYPD. There wasn't anything official I could find, but there were some blogs and stuff. Of course, there were, Chris grumbled. Honestly, Eli, I didn't for a long time. There came a point, really after I met Cam and we started hunting and fishing together some, I realized it wasn't God's fault Drake and his brothers did what they did. We talked for hours and hours for probably 6 months until I came to the place where I could really surrender what happened to me and accept the peace I wanted so much. I still struggle with my PTSD, as you saw, but I'm no longer ashamed of it. I'm not enslaved by it. I don't have to let it make me bitter. Monday morning, Chris dragged his feet through the halls as slowly as all the kids. The first day back after a long break was always tough, but the thing he'd miss most was not seeing Kayla most every day. They'd not really gotten a chance to talk much after that moment in his office, but his conviction that he'd not trusted God with his future as much as he did his past came crashing down after their conversation with Eli. He needed to talk with her about it all, tell her all his fears about Drake's impending release and what it might mean for anyone in his life. Ultimately, it was her decision if she wanted to get involved. He'd called Jace Saturday afternoon, and he'd suggested looping in his brother-in-law, Matt. Matt was a former Special Forces operative and CIA agent, computers being his greatest skill. After a chat with him, Matt had promised to keep close eyes on Drake and his brothers. He didn't fess up to how exactly he'd do that, but Chris honestly didn't care. He'd almost reached the administrative office doors when a scream from one of the history classrooms split the air. Templeton sprinted out of his office, as did his secretary, Mrs. Gray. What was that? Another scream sounded, followed by a bang and more students yelling. Rather than answer, Chris took off down the hallway, praying no one was hurt. Templeton hurried behind him, and Chris briefly registered his telling Mrs. Gray to be ready to call the police. What he expected to find in room 138, a junior world history classroom, he wasn't sure, but it certainly wasn't their quarterback, Bradley drew, standing on top of his desk and screaming at a pitch he wondered if they could hear all over town. Get it? Mr. Poplar, get it. Some of the girls stood in their chairs, while others stood around and laughed. All the boys besides Bradley had doubled over in laughter, and the teacher, Mr. Barker, had yet to get control of his own cackle. I'm sorry, Mr. Poplar, Mr. Templeton, he wheezed as they barreled into the room. I can't breathe. Barker, Templeton yelled over the fray. What in the world is going on? Briley Page, a cheerleader whose mother taught at the elementary school, pointed to the corner of the room. There's a mouse, she said through her own laughter. Bradley's not a fan. The quarterback shook his head wildly, quickly stepping his feet when the tiny mouse ran down the wall. No doubt looking for a way out of the chaos. Get it? Please. His buddy, Clay, had dumped the trash can and attempted to stalk the mouse into a corner. A mouse got stuck in his sleeping bag during a camping trip when we were 12. Hasn't had a lick of chill about it since. Compassion and amusement warred within him, but Chris willed it all down to focus on the task at hand. Bradley, you're going to break the desk if you don't stop. Could you get down to go ask Mrs. Anderson if she has anything we could use to trap him? Mrs. Anderson was the agriculture teacher, and she'd be the most likely to have something humane but effective. Bradley's face screwed up, and he shook his head. I'm not getting down, Mr. Poplar. Not while that thing's still in here. I'll call Mrs. Anderson, Templeton said from behind him. Hang tight, folks. Well, if nothing else, at least the Lord had kept his mind off Saturday's meltdown. Never a dull moment in education, that was for sure. The next 10 minutes were spent stalking a mouse with a trash can until Mrs. Anderson arrived with a jar of peanut butter in hand. Rolling her eyes, she lifted the jar. Anyone in here deathly allergic to peanuts? There wasn't. The only student they currently had with an airborne nut allergy was in 9th grade, and he wouldn't even come down this hall. Once they all shook their heads, Mrs. Anderson nodded quickly before opening the jar. I'm gonna scoop out some peanut butter and lay it on the floor. Poplar, when the mouse comes for it, you drop the can, okay? Bradley turned wide eyes on Chris. What are you gonna do with it once you catch it? You're not gonna kill it, are you? This kid. He was terrified of the thing, but he still didn't want it to die.
Nah,
Chris said as he followed Mrs. Anderson to the bookshelf the mouse had shimmied under. Figured I'd stick it in your locker in the field house. The whole class laughed, Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Templeton included, but Bradley's face paled once more.
Nuh-uh.
Don't even joke about that, Mr. P. You're safe. I figured we'd set it loose in the woods behind the baseball fields. He can live his life in peace and go tell all his mousy friends the story of how he brought down Bradley Page. Bradley saluted from atop the desk. Long as he's nowhere near me, he can tell them whatever he wants. Mrs. Anderson knelt to the floor with her spoonful of peanut butter, the metal clinking softly against the linoleum. Haven't met a mouse yet who can resist peanut butter. It took a minute, but she was right. Apparently, the scent was enough to lure the little rodent out from under the bookshelf. It was indeed a little field mouse, not a rat, and Chris honestly thought the thing was pretty cute. They got much larger ones out at the ranch, but no rodent of any size belonged in a classroom. As the mouse dove in for the peanut butter, Chris slammed the trash can over the top of him. Sliding a poster board under the bottom so the mouse didn't escape, Chris flipped the animal and the spoonful of peanut butter to the bottom of the trash can. The whole class burst into a raucous applause, Bradley cheering the loudest. You're my hero, Mr. P. Chuckling as he followed Mr. Templeton and Mrs. Anderson out of the classroom, Chris jerked his chin upwards. Here to serve, Bradley. Here to serve. Chapter 12. Okay, Gloria, Kayla said as she readied to grab Gloria from behind. I'm about to grab on now. Are you ready? As they advanced through the classes, Kayla wouldn't inform them what she was about to do, and neither would Jefferson. An assailant surely wouldn't, but for now, she needed Gloria to trust her own strength a little more. The woman jerked a nod, her dark curly hair pulled into a high bun. Her leggings and t-shirt were both black, but Kayla could still see the dots of sweat she'd worked up during the class. "You're doing great, Gloria. You can do this." With that, she grabbed Gloria in a diagonal line over her shoulder and across her torso. She'd barely gotten a hold when the woman froze in her arms. Her shoulders folded inward, and Kayla could feel her disassociating. "Stay with me, Gloria. You've got this. Do it for Eli and Sophia. Do it for yourself." Maybe it was the mention of her children or the thought of the woman she wanted to be, but Kayla felt the life immediately flow back into Gloria. She fought against the hold, not making much headway but trying just the same. Kayla tightened her grip, similar to how an assailant might, and began to try and pull Gloria further down the mat. Learning martial arts when she moved back to town after her treatment had been a lifeline for her. She'd gone twice a week all through college, only stopping organized classes when her gym closed down. It had been a sad day, but she'd funneled her membership dues into the equipment in her garage, and slowly but surely created her own studio. Sparring was a challenge when you were by yourself, but Jefferson and the other security guys were often willing to stand in if she felt like dusting off those particular skills. "Come on, Gloria," Jefferson called from where he stood with Lauren. "Remember your training. Breathe, assess, fight. You've got anger. Use it." The initial frenzy of Gloria's panic subsided, and she sent an elbow backwards into Kayla's side. Breath knocked from her, Kayla loosed her grip enough for Gloria to turn and drive a knee upwards into Kayla's nose. She felt the impact, the immediate burst of tears to her eyes, and heard rather than saw Gloria gasp and step back.
Oh no.
"Kayla. I'm so sorry. I think I kind of blacked out and did what felt right." Still unable to breathe for the second but prouder than she'd ever been, Kayla held both her hands in a thumbs up. Her eyes still flowed, blood had already begun seeping from her nose onto the cheerleading mats, but she couldn't have cared less. Lauren shoved a wad of tissues in her face to slow the flow as Harper came jogging over. "What happened?" Ever the nurse, Harper took the tissues from Lauren and held them as she studied Kayla's nose and cheeks. "I'll tell you what happened," Jefferson said with as big a grin as Kayla had seen since the first time Lauren managed to flip him on his back in the very same gym. "Our little Gloria found her fight." "You're gonna be okay, young lady," he said as though she wasn't only a few years younger than him. "You're gonna be fine." Jefferson was a military veteran, one who joined the team about 5 years before from what Rhonda told her. He'd been sent straight from the Lord, and he forever sacrificed his own well-being as a practice dummy for their classes. He never once complained, thrilled to see the women finding their fight. Breath finally restored, Kayla grabbed the second wad of tissues from Lauren and held them to her own face. Heedless of the fact she could barely see due to the tears and the throbbing in her nose, she took her free arm and pulled Gloria into a tight hug. "I'm so proud of you," she said in a slightly nasally voice due to the blood. "You put so much power behind that. It was instinct. I promise I didn't mean to hurt you. With my husband, I kind of checked out whenever he'd start in on me. What you said about fighting back, it took me to a place I didn't know I could go. I'm so sorry I hurt you, though." "I'm not," Kayla said honestly. "That's part of teaching these classes." Harper nearly broke one of Jefferson's ribs once, she said with a chuckle that sounded a little bit like a chipmunk. "I promise, I couldn't be happier." 30 minutes later, Kayla sat on the edge of the bleachers as Micah gently prodded her cheek. "I agree with Harper," he said softly as Sarah and Felicity watched on. He'd come to pick them up and been kind enough to take a look at her nose in the process. "I don't think it's broken. It'll give you a good bruise, but I don't think we need imaging unless you prefer it just to be safe." "I think it's fine," Kayla sighed. I'm so proud of her." Her face throbbed, and Jefferson had needed to take over the rest of class, but keeping the grin off her face while watching Gloria continue to spar with some of their other security staff was nearly impossible. "You do good work here, Mitchell," Micah said as he stood. "We're all lucky to have you." By the time everyone started to pack up their things, Kayla was still on cloud 9 from watching Gloria's progress. It was hard to keep herself from pumping her fist in the air in victory. Well, it would have been more difficult if even moving didn't hurt so much with a swollen nose, but a zipper bag full of ice from the gym's concession stand had helped immensely. Chris had been working in his office through the whole class, having unlocked the gym for them before asking them to let him know once they were done. Off of mat duty for once, Kayla stood from the bleachers and waved to Jefferson. "I'm going to let Chris know we're done. Are you guys good here?" "All good, boss," Jefferson replied. "You sure you're not dizzy or anything?" "Nope, I'm good. I'm not scheduled to work tomorrow, so I'll see you Monday, I guess." Removing the ice pack, any question about how badly she'd bruised went away at the sight of Jefferson's wince. "Look pretty bad?" "You definitely look like you were in a fight," Lauren said as she squatted to start rolling the last mat. "Which I guess you were, so it fits." Snickering, Kayla stepped off the bleachers and pushed through the heavy navy doors. It was interesting. At one time, walking through the school hallways with so many painful memories had felt like knives in her gut. Now, there was an entirely different feeling there at the prospect of seeing Chris. They'd turned some sort of corner the day of the cleanup, though even she couldn't say what it was yet. Blinking back her still watering eyes, Kayla didn't see Chris coming her direction until his uncharacteristically angry voice all but barked at her. "Kayla, what happened? Who did this?" She was so distracted by his tone she almost forgot what she looked like for a moment. "Oh, well dash." Chris took her face in his hands, studying her face she knew had already bruised and running his thumb gently over it. "Tell me who did this." Every bit of Chris's logic and rational thinking went out the window at the sight of Kayla's battered face. Her nose was so swollen it was a wonder she could breathe, and a bruise line ran from one cheekbone to the other. The purples and blues of the mark looked angry and painful, marring her beautiful skin in a way that sent his blood boiling. As though they had a mind of their own, Chris's hands raised to her cheeks, cupping them as softly as he could to run his thumbs over the bruises. "Tell me who did this." His voice came out on a growl, but he didn't even care. Had Gloria's husband found her and the kids? Harper had gotten hurt defending Frances from her ex-husband, Stuart. In Kayla's line of work, there were bound to be security issues on occasion. Would it cost him his job if he picked a fight with a wife-beater? Maybe, but he couldn't bring himself to care at the moment. His mind had whirled so quickly it was only when he realized Kayla's lips were moving that she was answering his question. "So then I told Gloria to fight for her kids and for herself, and it was like the dam finally broke. She didn't disassociate. She jammed an elbow into my side and then turned to knee me in the nose." Kayla grinned despite the obvious pain it brought, but her pride radiated as his own pulse started to calm. That's right. They'd been there for self-defense class this morning. The classes included sparring. It was why she was even in the school hallway in the first place. How had he forgotten so quickly? Heart still pounding but at least at a slower pace, Chris dropped his hands from her cheeks. "This has to hurt. Can I drive you to Micah's clinic? Were they even open on Saturdays?" One benefit of working in the school is that his immune system was basically a steel wall at this point. Nothing got through, as he'd had everything under the sun in his first few years. "You need to have that looked at." Micah and Harper both looked at it already. "They don't think it's broken." "Chris, you should have seen Gloria. She was like a warrior in there." Her eyes watered again, but this time he didn't think it was from the nose. "I can't believe it." Unable to resist any longer after the heightened emotion followed by the crash, Chris pulled Kayla into his arms. "You're really something, you know that?" She'd climbed right down into his pit with him in the office the Saturday before, helping him move through his panic attack without any judgment or hesitation. Not only that, but she'd pulled back and let him use his experience to help Eli when the boy had come to find him. She hadn't mentioned it in the week since, though they'd seen each other a few times when he'd come out to the shelter to help Eli get ready for basketball tryouts. He hadn't brought it up either, so they'd more or less let the subject go. But now, as she settled her face against his chest lightly, he thought about how much he liked the feeling of holding her. They'd not defined anything, but it was plain to see there was some sort of chemistry between the two of them. His qualms, especially knowing Drake Thorne was being released, felt like the greatest exercise of faith he'd ever take. Could he possibly release the control of staying unattached with as few vulnerabilities as possible? Could he open himself up to a woman like Kayla who crawled into the hard parts of life and wouldn't let him avoid his own hang-ups? There in the school hallway, the one where their story began and almost ended in a spectacular showing of flames, Chris held her as long as she'd let him. Did they stand there for 5 minutes? 10. He had no idea. All he knew was Kayla Mitchell was the only woman he'd not been able to shake. Even when she hated him, there'd been a pull. Even in high school. Kayla, I have a confession to make. She pulled back, her eyes beautiful despite the heavy bruising beneath them and her swollen nose. What's that? In high school, when I switched my eggs to jerky after you said you were allergic. I wasn't purely selfless with my motives. A smirk lifted one corner of her lip. Is that so? Yep. See, I had this crush on my chemistry tutor, and I knew she'd probably never kiss me if I kept eating the thing she was allergic to. Plus, I wasn't sure how allergic you were, and I really didn't want to send you to the hospital. Her mouth dropped open, and her eyes widened before she winced in pain from the expression. Note to self, don't make that face. Wait, you had a crush on me back then? Her voice sounded the slightest bit nasally, the swelling no doubt narrowing her airways. I did, and the only reason I'm not asking if I can kiss you right now is because I don't want to risk hurting you. Kayla didn't speak for a moment, but Chris couldn't bring himself to regret a thing he'd said. Laying his cards onto the table, despite the things that probably should hold them back, was his only option. Finally, she lifted up onto her tiptoes and rested her hands on his shoulders. I think it'll be worth the risk. No more capable of holding back now than he had been when he pulled her into his arms, Chris closed the distance between their lips. He was gentle, meaning what he said about not hurting her, but the kiss was electric. If he thought the fireworks that erupted any time they were in the same room when she hated him were brilliant, they had nothing on the feel of her lips on his. Chapter 13. It had been a week since their kiss in the school hallway, and they still hadn't defined what exactly was going on between them. Was she his girlfriend? Were they friends moving that direction? It felt a little odd, as an adult, to wonder if you were someone's girlfriend. Still, Kayla couldn't deny seeing Chris at the shelter so often as he helped Eli always made her day. He stopped in to chat with her, and today he'd asked her to go to the bakery with him. The Reindeer Pass Bakery was located downtown with the most perfect view of the resort from its front porch tables. As the March snowfall gave way to April rain, everything had begun the process of coming to life once more. It would be a few more weeks before the nights stayed above freezing, and they often had their annual Mother's Day snowfall. At least the sun was out as they moved up the bakery's front steps. Chris held his hand on the small of her back before stopping outside the door. I wanted to bring you here so we can talk to Matt. Her brows furrowed. At least, she could make the movement without pain. Her bruising had started to yellow on her cheeks, and her nose was its normal size once more. It was still tender, though, and it took a good deal of makeup to cover the odd, jaundiced skin. Why Matt? Matt was Becca's husband and some sort of security contractor who did a good deal of covert work. She really didn't know what he did other than what Sarah and Hannah had told her. Chris took a deep breath, shoving his hands in his pockets and staring at his boots. I told you Drake Thorne's getting released. He's keeping an eye on things for me. If something is going to come of this, he said as his eyes flew up to meet hers. You need all the information. He seemed nervous, genuinely afraid she'd leave if she didn't like what she heard. Compassion filled her for this man who'd always been kind to people but also held them at arm's length. He was definitely a golden retriever personality, one liked by adults and his students alike. Still, he kept most everyone here in Reindeer Pass at a safe distance. She'd once thought him stuck up, assuming he was too good to spend too much time with the rest of them, but that wasn't true at all. His past brought risk with it to anyone involved with him, and he'd sacrificed his own clearly extroverted tendencies in order to keep them safe. As she'd done the week before, Kayla rose to her tiptoes and pressed a kiss to his cheek. I'm here. Let's go talk to Matt. She couldn't promise anything until after their conversation. She didn't plan to walk away, but there was no way he'd believe it until she'd heard it all. His face softened a little from the pinch lines he'd held a moment before, but his eyes still looked tortured at the potential of what might happen. It was interesting. Reindeer Pass was a tourist town, but one most folks flocked to in the winter months. The ski resort was designed in a beautiful log cabin style, and the entire town looked like it was out of a Christmas movie when snow fell. The spring and summer had a beauty all their own. As things warmed up and the snow melted, it was like the quiet serenity of winter gave way to the new birth of spring. New life, new beginnings. It was almost like the very town itself promised a better tomorrow. Chris may not know Kayla wouldn't care what information Matt had to give them, but she did. Knowing how much time she'd lost holding on to hate that wasn't his to bear anyway had shifted something within her she hadn't realized needed shifting. Forgiveness for others made forgiveness for oneself possible. It was the only way she could move forward, and she wanted to move forward with Chris. "All right," he said somberly as he opened the door to the bakery. It was a little comical how his mood contrasted the cheery colors and bright spirits of the room around them, teal, yellow, purple, and a massive mural on one wall beckoning them inside. The smell of their new lavender honey cupcakes wafted out from the back as Sarah brought a new tray to the front. "Oh, hey, guys," she said brightly with a wave. "Let me pop these in the pastry case, and I'll let Matt know you're here." Matt worked most of the time out of the bakery's office. He technically worked from home, a contractor in some sort of cybersecurity firm. He'd recently hired the younger brother of one of Kayla's favorite true crime podcasters to work for him in product development, and she'd be lying if she didn't hope it meant his sister Gwen Jameson came to town at some point. "No need, Sarah," Matt said as he appeared in the doorway to the kitchen. "Come on back, guys." Chris held Kayla's hand tightly, almost as if he felt they were walking to the gallows, and maybe he did. Whoever Drake Thorne was and whatever he was tangled up in, it had gotten Chris betrayed, captured, and held hostage for nearly a week until his team had managed to infiltrate. That held on to a person in a chokehold, only loosening after hours and days and years of work to release it. To be honest, she didn't know how anyone did it without faith. Leading them through the large industrial kitchen to the office they'd recently expanded in the back, Matt gestured toward 2 chairs they kept in front of one of the 2 desks. "It's a weird setup, but Becca and I both have our desks and computers in here. Take a seat." If Matt had any questions about the nature of their relationship, he didn't ask them. Instead, he ran a hand over his short cropped brown hair and rested against his desk. Crossing his muscular arms over his chest, Matt took a deep breath. "So, Drake Thorne will be released in 3 weeks as long as he doesn't mess up again. I'm honestly not sure how he got parole after the load you helped them locate, but it is what it is." "His brothers probably paid off a judge," Chris grumbled. "What does that mean for me here? Am I on his radar?" "At the moment, no. Neither he nor his brothers have had any large payments leave their bank accounts either." "Wait," Kayla said. "How do you know that?" Matt shot her a wink, diffusing the tension a little. "Probably best you don't know. What you do need to know is I'm keeping a close eye on him. Any plane tickets purchased or large sums of money moving from any of their accounts will alert me. They don't know I'm watching them, and none of the communication with the prison has even mentioned you." Releasing her hand, Chris wiped his palms up and down his jeans. "So, for now at least, everyone is safe." His eyes flicked to hers, and Kayla did her best to smile reassuringly. "I don't need to relocate or go underground. My contact in Washington is keeping tabs too, but she can't tell me all the things you can. You're safe, and so is everyone you care about." Matt rounded his desk and sat in the oversized brown leather one behind it. "If that changes, I'll let you know." "Look," Matt said as he placed his elbows on the desk and looked Chris in the eye. "I almost lost Becca because I couldn't trust the Lord with her safety and our relationship. I get the unique position you're in more than you realize. I'm just saying, don't go taking on burdens that aren't yours to carry." Before Chris could respond, both of their phones pinged at the same time. Confused, Kayla pulled hers from her purse to see Jace's name flash across the screen.
Uh-oh.
Chris leaned over to look at the message. "What's going on?" "Eli's been picked up for shoplifting." Chris hurried down the hallway at the police station, all but sprinting to get to the kid as fast as he could. The marijuana accusations at school, the fight he'd broken up before it started, and now this? Templeton couldn't technically expel him for something that didn't happen on school property, but he could make his life miserable until he did something to justify it. Behind him, Kayla moved just as quickly. Had Gloria arrived yet? Did she even know? They'd basically run from the bakery to the police station at Jace's text, and neither had pulled their phones out since. "Jace," he said as he opened the door to the break room where Jace said he'd taken him. "We're here." At least, they hadn't taken him to the interrogation room. The break room had vending machines and plastic chairs around little plastic tables. There was a framed photo of Reindeer Pass on one wall and memorials to the K9 dogs who'd passed away. Jace opened the door, one of his deputies sitting at the table with Eli. Gloria was there as well, filling a cup with water for her shaking hands. Kayla immediately went to her and wrapped her arm around her, whispering something in her ear. A tear flowed down Gloria's cheek, but she nodded resolutely. "Let's all take a seat, shall we?" Jace pulled out a chair for Gloria as Chris did the same for Kayla. Eli stared at the table, his splotchy cheeks nearly ripping Chris's heart out at the first sign Eli was actually still a scared kid who'd been dealt a tough hand. Chris took the seat on the other side of Eli from Gloria, patting the kid's shoulder. "We're gonna get this figured out, buddy. Jace is really good at what he does." Without even asking, Chris knew Eli hadn't done this. If he had, he'd had a good reason. Whether it was his former cop gut, or that of an educator, he'd never been so sure of anything in his life. "So first," Jace said as he pulled a recorder from his pocket and pushed a button. "I want you to know we're all here for you, Eli. You said at the convenience store you didn't put the stuff in your bag. Can you tell us how you think it got there if it wasn't you? I mean, Connor, Daniel and Jackson were all there when I walked in. I didn't see them get close, but they hate me." Jace nodded, making a note on his legal pad. "Why do they hate you?" "Because Olivia likes me," he said with the smallest of smiles. Shrugging his shoulders, he looked back at the table. "She asked me to the spring dance, and it made Connor mad. That's what started this whole thing." Jace looked up at Chris. "Mr. Poplar, did you have any knowledge of these events prior to now?" "Yes. It's been an ongoing issue at the school that we're working on." He wasn't the least bit defensive of the ways they'd been trying to handle it, but so far Connor and his friends had been sneaky. It had been Jackson who'd tipped off the teacher about the marijuana, but when he'd been pulled in and questioned he said he'd heard a rumor. Nodding again, Jace turned back to Eli. "Did you feel them putting anything in your bag?" "No, but I bet it's on camera. They're not very smart, and there are security cameras all around that store." Eli's grumbled comment drew a snort from Kayla. "Sorry," she said quickly as the rest of them fought their own grins. He's not wrong." "He's not," Jace said as he made one final note. "We've got one of our officers reviewing the footage as we speak." His phone buzzed on the table. "Speaking of which, that's her now. Let me step out and take a look, and I'll be right back." Jace stood, followed by his deputy, and the two of them moved through the door which left only Kayla, Chris, Gloria, and Eli. As soon as the cops shut the door, Eli placed his head in his hands. "I really didn't do it, guys. I promise." "We believe you," Chris said softly. "We know you didn't do it. What did they say you stole, anyway?" "Some candy." He listed off the items pulled from his back after he checked out at the register with his soda. "Why would I even go to the trouble of stealing it when we've got Ms. Lauren's cinnamon rolls at the shelter? I mean, who would do that?" Gloria wrapped her son in a tight hug, her head on his shoulder. "No one with any taste buds, that's for sure. Mr. Poplar is right. We believe you." Kayla nodded her confirmation as well as Jace knocked and opened the door once more. "Well, I've got good news and bad news," he said as he sat back down. "The good news is it was clear someone stuffed something in your bag before you left, which set off the alarms since they hadn't been scanned. The bad news is the person wore a hoodie and long pants, so we couldn't tell exactly who it was." Jace's mouth flattened into a thin line, and Chris knew he wasn't the only one frustrated. He knew Connor and his buddies had been behind it, but the grocery store was large and likely crowded. They couldn't accuse them without any actual proof. "Does that mean I'm free to go?" Eli's voice was strong, sliding back into the role he'd held for most of his life. Yep. We'll let you know if we have any further questions. As the four of them exited the police station, Chris placed his hand on Eli's shoulder once more. Look, we're all doing our best to make sure you stay safe, but I'd feel better if you try to avoid those guys altogether. He wasn't at all convinced they wouldn't try to jump him off school property, and 3-on-1 would be a bloodbath.
Yeah.
I will. Thanks, Mr. Poplar. Eli was quiet for a moment before looking up at Chris again. I guess it's like you said. The Lord fights for us, right? Memories of the conversation while they shot hoops and worked drills at the shelter brought a wide smile to Chris's face. The Lord would fight for him too with Drake Thorne. He had to be still. Wrapping his free arm around Kayla's shoulders, he allowed himself to relax for the first time in weeks.
Yeah,
buddy. He sure does. Chapter 14. Rhonda stood in the lobby of the Reindeer Pass Animal Shelter with equal parts amusement and skepticism. Girl, this is either the best idea you've ever had, or it's going to blow up in our face. Cages lined the walls on both sides with snoozing dogs in some of them, while others played in the open space they had for different dogs based on their size. Leashes hung on the wall of all shapes and sizes, as did collars and vests. A cat room sat off the entrance, its large window spotted with tiny little paw prints as cats climbed the cat towers and the room's furniture alike. Who doesn't love to play with animals? Kayla had connected with one of Harper's friends in town named Brianna Taylor. She owned the animal shelter that took in not only dogs and cats, but also domesticated rabbits, guinea pigs, hamsters, and even birds if the owners could no longer take care of them. It was a no-kill shelter, but that meant Brianna was often up to her eyeballs in more work than she could take on. She and Harper had met at a Pilates class a few years before, and Kayla had seen her a few times at different town events. Now, though, Brianna stepped out of the shelter's office and shut the door behind her. She wore a wide grin, her loose-cut jeans held up with a thick leather belt. It looked like it might be a man's belt, but the jeans were at least 2 sizes too large on her. Hi, ladies. Brianna's dark hair, almost black, contrasted with her face to make a strikingly beautiful impression. Her t-shirt donning the shelter's logo was faded with her name tag peeling from its backing, but the woman didn't seem to notice. Her hair was pulled back in a claw clip, some of its waves pulling loose as she removed the vests from 2 Labrador retrievers. Rhonda and Kayla had brought the ladies here for an afternoon of volunteering. They'd mostly be cleaning kennels, taking dogs for walks, helping with minor touch-up repairs, and getting some snuggles in while they were at it. Lauren had been ecstatic, as she was an animal lover through and through. Frances wouldn't be doing any kennel cleaning, as she could quite literally go into labor any day now, but Brianna had assured them she had some filing work she could do sitting down. As for Stacy, Gloria, Keely, and Teresa, they'd all been a little hesitant at the idea, but agreed it might be fun. Thank you so much for coming, Brianna said. Her hair was thick, but it looked like it had been a bit since she'd had some time to really care for it. Her ends had clearly started splitting, and there was a small hole in her t-shirt. The top was loose, and Kayla wondered if Harper knew how thin her friend had gotten since the last time they saw her. There could be plenty of reasons for that, but it still pricked Kayla's concern. I can't tell you how much the help means to me. We're happy to be here, and we hope we can work together today to lift some of your burden, Kayla said brightly. The women here had been dealt a difficult hand, and so had the animals. If they'd allow themselves the chance, they might find some common ground. Brianna nodded. I'm sure you will. I need a couple of ladies cleaning kennels. Any of the ones with a red ribbon on the latch are our more spicy friends, so skip those and let me work through them later. There are buckets, rags, mops, brooms, and scoopers in the utility closet there. Someone can take the dogs for walks in groups while the others clean their kennels, if you think it would be easier. The women discussed briefly amongst themselves who'd take on what role before Brianna continued. After that, we need to replace the litter in all the litter boxes and repair a few of the cushions on the couch in the cat room for obvious reasons if anyone's handy with a needle and thread. She shrugged, eyeing the window into the cat room lovingly. They love to scratch at it, but they also love to nap on it. I can't take it away from them. I know my way around a sewing project, Rhonda said. Happy to help. Perfect. Now, I'll be along to join you ladies in a few minutes, but first we have a couple of canine friends who need to have their anal glands expressed. It's quite the smelly undertaking, so I won't subject any of the rest of you to that. Lauren raised her hand. I used to be a vet tech. I don't mind helping with that if it would free you up to do some other things. Had they known Lauren used to be a vet tech? She hadn't shared a whole lot about her life before she married. Her ex-husband had been one who believed women should stay home once children were born, and Kayla knew he'd forced her to quit her job when she was pregnant with Wilson. You were a vet tech? Yep, Lauren answered. A blush rose in her cheeks. I was actually planning to go to vet school, but life got in the way. Rather than let the moment linger into awkwardness or sadness, Brianna scrolled on her phone until a cheery pop tune rang out from the Bluetooth speakers. Friend, you got yourself a job. I don't know about you ladies, but I think today is a great day to clean some kennels. Over the next 3 hours, Lauren helped Brianna out with a host of things from expressing glands to minor medical attention the animals needed. They had veterinarians come in on rotation, donating their time and resources, but it was usually a few weeks in between visits. Rhonda worked in the cat room, stitching up the sofa cushions and becoming a cat tower in her own right, while the rest of them cleaned dog kennels. Frances, as planned, worked behind the desk, but there wasn't a lick of disappointment. Her companions back there were some adorable 3-week-old kittens who were too young to go in the kitten room and still needed to be bottle-fed. Lauren and Brianna gave her a crash course in that, and Frances might have had the most fun of all of them. Keely and Teresa took the dogs outside for walks while Kayla, Stacy, Gloria, Brianna, and Lauren cleaned kennels. It went quickly with all of them helping, and even the ache in Kayla's shoulders was one with a sense of accomplishment. Stopping to squat down outside one of the red ribbon cages, Lauren stared at the large mastiff mix inside. What's this guy's story? Brianna paused, staring sadly at the beautiful and massive brindle animal. His face was saga like a mastiff, and his size told them he had plenty of it inside. There was also something else in his build that didn't quite fit. That's Bruno. He's been with us for nearly a year, and he still won't let me get close. He'll barely let me clean his cage and feed him, but I do the best I can. He was used in a dog fighting ring and beaten into meanness by his previous owners. He almost bit the animal control officers who picked him up, and it was touch and go when they got him here. I had to beg them to let me try and get through to him rather than put him down, but I'm not sure what kind of life I've subjected him to. Bruno stood in the far back corner of his kennel, every bit of his stance defensive within his strong body. He looks healthy, Lauren said softly. You're doing a good job with him, but I know it's hard. Kayla didn't insert herself in the conversation, sensing it wasn't something that needed her input. Gloria, however, surprised her by speaking up. You're doing the best you can. It's not your fault if the wounds are too big to heal. Lauren took a treat from her pocket. Can he have this?
Yeah.
If he'll eat it. He's not all that food motivated. Tossing the treat gently into the kennel, Lauren smiled despite Bruno's growl. Now. There's no need to be dramatic, sir. I'm trying to give you a treat. I've not met a dog yet who can resist this brand. She winked at Brianna. I may have picked up a few bags yesterday when Kayla told me we were coming out here. They're my secret weapon. Bruno took one step forward, only to shrink back against the wall. Lauren pulled her hand back through the cage bars, maintaining the most relaxed posture Kayla thought she'd seen from her. It's okay, buddy. I know what it's like to be scared. You're safe now. Her words trailed off at the end, and she pulled one more treat from the bag before stuffing it back in her pocket. Do you ever feel guilty for not getting your kids out sooner? Gloria asked as she sat cross-legged on the freshly cleaned floor. Her guilt had been obvious, but she'd never mentioned it in their group sessions. Lauren scoffed. Only every day of my life. Keely and Teresa came back through the door and returned the last round of dogs to the newly cleaned kennels. I don't know if I'll ever be completely free from it. If I had left earlier, the shelter might not have been there for me. Where would we have ended up? There's no way I could support 3 growing boys on a vet tech salary, not if they actually wanted to eat. Oh, are we talking mom guilt? Keely plopped herself down on the floor, leaning her head back against the wall. My constant companion. What did I teach the girls about the way they should be treated by a man? Are they scarred for life? Did I make the right call by telling them they could skip their homework last Thursday after a super long day? Did they eat their vegetables or just macaroni and cheese for dinner? It never ends. Brianna placed the towel she used to dry a wet spot back in her bucket. At least you're in good company. It's not just moms of human children who second-guess every decision they make. She chuckled, letting out a long breath. I constantly wonder if I'm making the right decisions with these babies. Many of them have led such hard lives. I want them to find homes, but I want it to be the right home. Before anyone could respond, Bruno stepped forward and ate the first treat Lauren had tossed on the ground. His brown eyes moved upwards to meet hers, and Kayla watched in awe as he stepped forward again to take the second one. He didn't come any closer, but if Brianna's slack-jawed expression was any indication, it was a first for the broken giant. I get it, sweet boy, Lauren said sadly. I know it's hard to open your heart up again. Somebody has to work really hard to gain your trust. She didn't elaborate, but Kayla had wondered for a while whether there was more going on between Lauren and their head of security Jefferson than either of them wanted to admit. Both watched the other while they didn't think anyone noticed, and he always managed to pair up with her in defense classes. The Lord would have to be the one who healed any of their hearts. She could teach them coping skills and help them learn to manage the difficult moments all day long, but ultimately it was him who would bring them peace. How anyone found even a semblance of it without knowing him, she had no idea. Even those who did, those like her who'd harbored bitterness in their heart for wrongs done to them years earlier, it sometimes felt impossible. Whether it was for her mistaken target of Chris or the actual perpetrators, all bitterness would do was turn her into a shell of who she was meant to be. Bruno's legs shook as he stood there, only 2 feet from Lauren with the bars in between, but he stood nonetheless. It felt so similar to how the women there had been forced to stand on their own shaking legs, fighting even when the fight had been all but taken from them. Kayla pushed to her feet, satisfied with all the progress they made that day. The kennels were fresh and clean, and the dogs were happy in their new surroundings. Well, ladies, I think we've earned ourselves a sweet treat from the bakery. What do you say? Brianna, come and join. It's on us. Better, Chris said as he watched Eli's shot sail straight into the hoop. That's much better. They'd been working together on preparing for the school's basketball tryouts later that month. Eli had some raw talent. He'd clearly been taught proper fundamentals, but he was rusty after not picking up a ball for nearly 2 years. Thanks, Mr. Poplar. You really think I've got a chance to make the team? Chris took a seat on the bench that overlooked the basketball courts, thinking through all the progress they'd made.
Yeah,
Bud. I really do. Especially for the junior varsity. You've got promise, and Coach Brown could really use someone of your height on that team. He was already tall at only 14, 5 feet 8 inches or 5 feet 9 inches if Chris had to guess, and the way he was eating hinted at a growth spurt. I'd keep working on your speed and agility, plus that vertical leap, but you're well on your way. He'd probably lost some endurance too in the time he hadn't played, but that would be earned back with practice. Coach Brown liked to run drills to build both the skill and endurance, a method he'd had success with since he took over the teams. Eli kept shooting, working on keeping his shoulders squared towards the basket and following through with his shooting hand. Mr. Poplar, can I ask you a question? Of course. Do you think my dad is going to stay in jail? Mr. Santos had been arrested after Gloria gave her report to the police, but they were still waiting to go before a judge. I don't know, buddy. I hope so, but either way you're safe here. So is your mom and Sophia. The shelter's tall fences, robust security system, and team headed up by Jefferson made sure of that. Eli was quiet for a moment, the only sound that of a dribbling ball. I know. I'll feel better when he's convicted. Do you think they'll let me testify? Doing his best to be honest without going overboard, Chris silently prayed for God's guidance. If you want to, they might. Do you want to? Nodding, Eli shot again. The night before we came to the shelter, I got home late from studying at a friend's house. Dad got mad, and he came at me with his belt. Chris's fists clenched, but he did his best not to show the anger that flowed through him at what this kid had experienced. I'm so sorry. He didn't actually manage to get me because Mom got between us. I tried to break it up because it was my fault in the first place. That's how I hurt my arm. He pushed me into the corner of a stair. You know none of that was your fault now, right? Kids sometimes get home late. It's not a reason for a grown man to hit his family. Choosing his words as carefully as he could, Chris stood and closed the distance between the bench and where Eli stood there dribbling slowly. Placing a hand on the kid's shoulder, Chris looked him straight in the eyes. None of that was your fault. Not a single moment. He made his choices, and a weak man takes out his anger on others. You're nothing like him, Eli. I hope you know that. Tears filled Eli's eyes, a few spilling over onto his cheeks and suddenly making him look like the child he'd not been allowed to be. How could you possibly know that? You don't even know him. Because I know you. Chris brought his arm down, grabbing the ball with as fancy a flourish as he could muster in the moment. Now, why don't we put those skills to use with some one-on-one? Chapter 15. Seriously, Harper. You look gorgeous. Your hair is perfect, you can stop primping. Kayla giggled as she watched her friend try for what had to have been at least the 5th different updo she'd attempted on her wild, red hair. The guys will be here soon. Robert and Felicity were getting married, a day that had been over a decade in the making. Despite all the things that drove them apart, they found their way back to each other to create the family both of them had prayed for. It was beautiful, and Kayla couldn't wait to experience the small ceremony and reception they'd planned at the lodge's glass-walled wedding venue. Felicity's daughter, Annie, would be the flower girl, and Micah and Sarah would stand up with them. Right on cue, Kayla's doorbell rang. Chris had asked her the week before if she'd consider being his date to the wedding, and she'd happily accepted. Where their future would lead, she had no clue, but they had all the time in the world for that. He'd surrendered control enough to take the next step, and that was enough for her. Besides, they still had to get to know one another again. She knew the boy he'd been and the man she thought he was now, but there was so much left to learn. Fine. I guess the minister can't exactly be late to the wedding. Harper stood, her soft green dress beautiful against her light skin. And despite her qualms, her hair did look beautiful in the loose bun she'd managed to tame it into. Let's do this. Kayla wore blue, the color of the wildflowers that would be popping up on the mountain outside the lodge's event room. If it wasn't chilly, they'd probably even roll up the large windows to turn it into an indoor-outdoor combination. Grab your purse, lady. It's time to get our girl married. They'd all gone shopping for Felicity's dress in Bozeman back in February, as the engagement was always planned to be short and sweet. They'd managed to find the perfect dress for her, no alterations necessary in what could only be described as a miracle. Moving to her front door, Kayla stared a little longer than was polite at the sight of Chris in his black suit and blue tie that perfectly matched her dress. How did you? Did I tell you what color my dress was? Chris grinned, not looking the least bit embarrassed at the recon he'd clearly done. Nope, Harper did. She didn't tell me how absolutely breathtaking you'd look in it. Leaning down, Chris pressed a soft kiss to Kayla's cheek. I don't think words could have done it justice. The sound of Harper all but swooning behind her jarred Kayla's feet back to the ground. Ah, you two are so cute. I'm so glad you don't hate each other anymore. It makes double dating so much easier. Cam snorted, taking a step around Kayla to slip his arm around Harper's waist.
Yeah.
If you hadn't reconciled, we were going to be forced to lock you in a room together at some point. That can get messy. The four of them rode in Cam's truck to the lodge, and Cam and Chris headed to the groom's suite while the girls went to Felicity's. She'd invited them to come by and have some treats from the bakery before the ceremony, and Kayla knew without a doubt she was going to sob at the sight of the woman in her dress again. Knock, knock, Harper said as the two of them cracked open the door to the suite. Everyone decent? It was Felicity, Sarah, and Hannah in the room for the moment. "Where's Annie?" "My mom's braiding her hair," Felicity answered. "They want to surprise me with her final look." As Kayla had expected, her friend looked like an absolute princess. Hannah and Jace had eloped rather than face the difficulty of navigating her family complications, as had Micah and Sarah a few months later. She couldn't blame them, but a wedding had always been one of her favorite things. "Oh, Felicity. You are the most beautiful bride I've ever seen," Kayla said as she grabbed a tissue from the table. "Sorry, weddings always make me cry. I'm so happy for you both." After all the time they spent apart, some might think those years were wasted, but it wasn't true. The path they followed got them Annie, and it ultimately brought them back together. They'd never take each other for granted because they knew what it meant to be without. By the time she'd taken her seat next to Chris, Kayla had cried no fewer than 5 times. She cried when Annie came bounding in the room looking like a tiny cupcake in her poofy dress. She cried again when Felicity's dad came in, and again when Micah came to see his sister on her wedding day. Another one thrown in for good measure, Harper had eventually steered her out in an attempt to protect what was left of her makeup. When the music started, Chris reached over and took her hand. "I don't think I've ever seen you cry this much." "Neither have I," Harper whispered. Who'd have thought the true crime junkie was such a softie when it came to weddings? The truth was, Kayla hadn't listened to most of her favorite true crime podcasts since she'd started working at the shelter. It was all too much, but she'd replaced it with things easier on her soul. "Look, they're really special, okay? Our friends have invited us to witness the first day of the rest of their lives. That's an honor." Chris chuckled, wrapping his arm around Kayla's shoulders and pressing a soft kiss to her head. "Don't ever change, honey. Not even a little." The wedding was as beautiful as he'd expected it to be, but it paled in comparison to the woman in his arms. The sun had long set over the mountains, and they'd closed the glass windows as the temperature had cooled off. The dinner had been good, he assumed, but Chris had been too focused on getting Kayla out on the dance floor to care much about it. Her blonde hair curled lightly down her back, her makeup mostly gone due to the copious amounts of tears she'd shed before and during the ceremony. Still, her light brown eyes were the most beautiful ones he'd ever seen. Would they ever have their own happily ever after that followed years of misunderstanding and anger? Soft blue lighting lit the room, as well as the soft white lighting that ran the perimeter of the dance floor. It created an ethereal atmosphere, but Chris wouldn't have cared if they stood in the middle of a dirt mound as the soft music played in the background. They'd danced 2 songs already, and if he had his way, they'd dance every single one for the rest of the night. As Chris spun Kayla around the dance floor, he couldn't help but hope it would be the case. "What was your favorite part about the wedding?" Lips stretching into a wide smile, Kayla thought for a moment. The two of them walking back down the aisle holding Annie's hands. They're going to be the best little family, and all 3 of them deserve it. They will. Robert and Felicity had been a few years younger than the 2 of them in school, but since she came back to teach drama at the high school, Chris had slowly seen the light come back in her eyes as she and Robert found their way back to one another. And they do. If the massive white, sparkly tool in Micah's arms was any indication, the now 5-year-old was fast asleep as he swayed her back and forth on the dance floor. He and Sarah had danced for a while, but now Sarah sat with Micah and Felicity's parents and watched the couples move. Hannah and Jace danced close by, as did Cam and Harper. It was all special, the realization that so many of their friends had found love, found their home in another person over the last year. "I'm really glad you've been getting closer to the rest of the girls from church." For years, Kayla had existed on the outskirts of their friends. She'd put herself there, and he didn't feel guilty for a crime he hadn't committed. It still made him happy to see she'd worked her way into the group. Everyone needed community, everyone needed family. "Me too," she said as she laid her head on his shoulder. "They've filled a hole in my life I didn't realize I had. I can't believe I spent so long holding on to anger and bitterness, but all I can do is move forward with the life I have now." Chris ran his hand up and down her back as a slow country song played over the speakers. "I'm glad. The older I get, the more I realize how little of the things we worry about in life are actually worth holding on to. Which category Drake Thorne would fall into remained to be seen, but it was past time for him to surrender the whole situation to the Lord. The brightest intelligence officers in the country, not to mention Matt and his very specific set of security skills, were watching the situation closely. He could let it go and focus on the woman he held that seemed to hold his whole future in her eyes. As the music swelled, Chris reached up to take Kayla's chin with his thumb and forefinger. Some things, though, they're very much worth holding tight. If you'll let me, I'd love to hold you for as long as it takes for us to see where this thing goes. She blinked rapidly, clearly still emotional from the wedding itself. I can't believe we're here after all this time. Her blonde hair shone under the lights, beautifully imperfect after the long day and dancing. After how awfully I treated you. Sweetheart, the past is the past. I'm far more interested in the future. With that, he closed the distance between their lips. Forever felt attainable, the past a distant memory as he imagined doing this very thing in the ranch's pasture in 50 years. As he pulled back, Chris pressed his forehead to hers. As far as I'm concerned, my future includes you. Chapter 16. Gloria moved her crochet hook through the bright yellow yarn of the blanket she worked on in the passenger seat, keeping her hands busy as a new coping tool for the drive over the Colson River Bridge. Turned out, she and Frances had bonded over the practice as the younger woman taught her a few different stitches to practice. How was Robert and Felicity's wedding? Cheeks warming at the memory of the hours of dancing she and Chris had done, as well as the kiss that had ended the night and sent her flying for hours, Kayla grinned. It was such a wonderful wedding. Felicity was beautiful, and Annie was the cutest flower girl you'll ever see. Robert and Felicity were a love story the entire town rooted for. As she'd gotten to know Felicity over the last few months, Kayla had heard a little more about their relationship and what had caused her to go to LA in the first place. Robert's father was a manipulative and very rich man back in New York, but he'd sent Robert to Reindeer Pass to live with his uncle when he was kicked out of boarding school. His uncle had actually been the head of the Fish and Wildlife Department at the time, so Robert's entire career trajectory changed as he fell in love with the mountains around Reindeer Pass and all the flora and fauna they held. Felicity had gotten pregnant her senior year of high school, but she'd lost the baby before she had a chance to tell Robert anything about it. His father had found out through a series of unfortunate events, and he'd threatened her to leave town or Robert would lose his inheritance and her own father might lose his dental practice. Robert had walked away from his father's money and manipulation anyway, but it was too late by then. Thankfully, the Lord had redeemed their story, and their second chance was a pure and beautiful picture of his power to mend broken things. Sweet Annie, the little girl Robert would now be adopting since they'd married, had looked every bit the princess in her cupcake-shaped white dress with pink sparkles and tiara. Sophia squealed from the back seat. The pictures you showed me looked like a fairy tale. She looked like a princess, and the cake looked so yummy. She was in for a treat when they got back to the shelter after picking up Eli from his shift at the ranch. Felicity had actually sent an entire leftover sheet cake back to the shelter for the women and children to enjoy. She and Robert had gone on a short honeymoon to a mountain cabin a few hours away, and she said there was no way they'd be able to finish it off. Even with the 2 slices Becca had taken back to the bakery to wrap up for the freezer to be eaten on their first anniversary, there was more than enough to feed an army. Becca had truly outdone herself on their cake. It was 4 tiers of perfection. 2 of the layers were triple chocolate, while the other 2 were vanilla buttercream. It was all covered in vanilla buttercream frosting with edible white and gold flowers cascading down the side. Sarah said she'd been working on the details for days, and she'd sketched at least 10 different variations before she settled on one she loved. She sure did, Kayla said softly as thoughts of hers and Chris's evening filled her with hope for the future. So many things were still unsolved, namely Drake Thorne's impending release, but for the moment they were moving forward. Rather than let doubt and fear creep in about whether he'd decide to end things once the man actually got released, she simply gave the situation to the Lord over and over again. Sometimes, it was a daily battle, but for the first time in her life, she refused to try and do it all in her own power. How are you feeling, Gloria? Sophia had gone back to singing a song about a bullfrog in the back seat, kicking her little legs in her booster seat. She wasn't paying attention to them, and Kayla turned up the air in the back to try and drown out anything Gloria needed to say. I'm nervous, she said honestly as they drew closer to the bridge. The only way I'll beat the fear is to keep trying, right? Right. I'm so proud of you, Gloria. I hope you know that. As they drew closer to the bridge, a gray truck pulled out of a side street behind them. At first, Kayla didn't think much of it, but all of a sudden the truck pulled up to within mere feet of her bumper. Hold your horses, man. It's a 2-lane road. Her grumbled words were quiet, but Gloria's nervous eyes still glanced at the mirror anyway. Who even was that? She recognized most folks in Reindeer Pass, but not the gray truck which seemed to get closer and closer with each passing moment. As Kayla tapped her brakes of her SUV in an attempt to communicate to the man to back up, the rev of his motor sounded, and he slammed into their back bumper. Gloria, Kayla said softly on the off chance Sophia didn't notice what was happening. I need you to grab my phone and call Chris. They were a mile or two from the ranch, but there was no place to pull over due to the soft shoulder and bridge ahead. To her credit, Gloria pulled the phone from the cup holder with shaking hands. Kayla didn't register exactly what she said, but her heart slowed a little at the fact he'd answered. Help was on the way. As she'd whispered a quick prayer for wisdom, the truck rammed into the back of them again. Mommy! Sophia screamed as her eyes filled with tears. It's okay, baby, Gloria said as she reached behind her to grab her daughter's hand. We'll be fine. Her eyes clenched shut, and Kayla could hear whispered pleas in Spanish for God to protect them. The third time the truck rammed their back bumper, Kayla felt herself lose control of the wheel the second before they barreled off the road and down the embankment towards the river. They'd barely missed the steel bridge barricade, and Kayla wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. At the moment, no matter how she tapped her brakes, there was no stopping the car as it turned on its side and began tumbling down the hill towards the murky water below. Hey, Mr. Poplar, Eli said as he dumped the last of the soiled hay in the wheelbarrow outside Lightning's stall. Your phone's ringing. It's Miss Kayla. Chris marked off the last of the feeding list for the day, satisfied they'd been able to feed and turn out all the horses nearly twice as fast as when Eli had first started working at the ranch. Coming. Unable to keep the grin off his face as he swiped the green icon, Chris pressed the phone to his ear. Hey, beautiful. You guys running late? They were supposed to come pick up Eli in the next few minutes, but maybe they'd hit a snag. The smile immediately fell from his face when the sound of Sophia wailing and screaming for her mother was punctuated only by the sound of the crash of metal on metal. Chris, Gloria's soft voice said. Chris, someone's trying to run us off the road. We can see the Colson River Bridge from here. His heart hammered in his chest as he pulled his keys from his pocket and broke into a run towards his truck. Gloria, hang on. I'm coming. He hadn't even realized Eli had followed him until the kid slid into the passenger seat beside him. Stay calm. It was no use arguing with Eli about coming. They didn't have time to fight, and Eli would jump in the truck bed if he tried to leave him behind. That kid was more than a good big brother and son, he'd been the man of the house long before he should have been. Gloria let out a startled yelp, and Chris heard another bang. This time, Sophia wailed louder and what he hoped wasn't the sound of the vehicle turning on its side blasted through the phone. It was only then he heard Kayla's voice call out. He's run us off the road, Chris. She shouted, and if he hadn't already, the sound would have had him peeling out of the driveway. As it was, dust flew up behind them as he barreled down the dirt road, heedless of any potholes he might hit unless they were deep enough to slow them down. He could deal with his truck later. Kayla. Rustles and more bangs sounded, almost as if the phone bounced around inside the vehicle. There was no way she could hear him, but all of a sudden the sickening sound of one last thud and a splash of water sent his entire body into the highest alert he'd ever been. We're going to sink, Chris, she shouted as the sound grew more muffled. South Shore, send help. With that, the line went dead, and Chris tossed his phone to Eli. Call 911 and tell them a car has gone into Colson River near the South Shore with 2 women and a little girl inside. Eli's eyes widened, but he did as he was told with every bit the detached crisis management Chris knew he'd developed in years living with his father. Lord, he prayed in a whisper as he pressed the pedal to the metal on the county road. Please let us get to them in time. Don't let it end like this. Chapter 17. There was no use shouting any more instructions, but Kayla doubted the phone even worked anymore anyway with the way it had whacked against nearly every surface in the SUV. Water seeped in as the vehicle had flipped upside down in deep enough water to submerge it. Of course, they couldn't roll to a stop on the bank. No, they'd had to hit the retaining wall that sent them flying an extra few feet as though it had acted like a ramp. Continuing the silent prayer, Kayla breathed a sigh of relief that Sophia still wailed in the back seat. Sophia. Can you swim, honey? Please say yes. Please say yes. I can. The girl was sobbing, but there was no time to talk her down. Gloria? As Kayla unbuckled her own seatbelt, she turned to find Gloria slumped in the passenger seat as blood seeped from the side of her head. Gloria. When the woman still didn't respond, Kayla knew she had no choice but to break the windows and free them herself. Water seeped inside slowly for the moment, but the second she broke Sophia's window, it would swallow them whole in seconds. Could they wait for help? Her question was answered when one of the back windows started to crack. The pressure of the water was too much as the car bounced lightly on the bottom of the river. It wasn't that deep, at least she didn't think it was. All right, honey. No time to wait. I'm going to help you undo your seatbelt, and when I break your window, I want you to swim to shore. Stay there, and if you see Mr. Poplar, tell him where we are. It was dark, the water murky this far down, and Sophia whimpered. I don't know if I can. You can, baby. You have to. Find your brave, Sophia. Come on. The little girl sniffed, but she muttered the softest, most pitiful a yes Kayla had ever heard. Pulling her multi-tool from the glove box, Kayla went ahead and pressed the seatbelt release for Gloria. Something must have tweaked it in the crash, as it was stuck. Water rushed in faster, and Kayla once again prayed as she worked. Lord, help me make the right decision. Knowing Gloria, knowing any mother, they'd always choose their child. Before the glass gave way, Kayla climbed into the back of the upside-down SUV, grabbed Sophia around the waist, and pointed the glass-breaking tip at the already struggling window. Big breath, honey. Then, kick to the surface with everything in you. If Sophia responded, she didn't hear her, as she'd already jammed the multi-tool's tip into the shuttering window. It gave way easily, and the water rushed inside as quickly as she'd thought. Glass flowed by in an endless stream of jagged points, but that wasn't the most important part. Getting Sophia free of the current that poured into the car was. Shoving the girl through the window, Kayla followed shortly after. She grabbed Sophia by the hand, her eyes burning with the effort of opening them underwater in whatever chemicals had leached from the car. Pushing the little girl's torso, Kayla shoved her upwards in an attempt to get her free of the whirlpool the car's sinking had caused, relieved at the sight of her kicking in a continuous upward momentum. Lord, get her to the surface. Get her to the shore safely. Give me the oxygen I need to help her mother. There was no time to watch Sophia, as every passing second robbed Gloria of more and more oxygen. The surface called to Kayla, begging her to come and take a breath, but leaving Gloria behind wasn't an option. It was now or never. Using the window she'd climbed out of, Kayla swam as quickly as she could through the now filled car to the front seat. If only she could see better down here, but the water was so murky. She hadn't thought to grab the light. Was it even waterproof? The multi-tool made quick work of Gloria's seatbelt, but now Kayla could feel the constriction of her lungs as she worked to pull Gloria towards the window as well. Her already limited vision started to go dark, but she shook her head quickly. No, 5 more seconds. If she could get them out of the car, at least then they might float to the top for Chris to rescue them. She'd barely gotten her head out the window in an attempt to drag Gloria behind her when spots danced in front of her vision once more. The last conscious thought before she went under was seeing a sliver of light above and a hand reaching towards her as though Jesus himself had come to take her home. Chris slammed the parking brake of his truck into place and threw open the door in the same moment. The hill leading down to the water's edge was steep and muddy, his boots hardly the best for such terrain, but there wasn't a thing in him that would wait even a second. The water bubbled about 4 feet past the retaining wall, and Chris could barely make out the darkening water a few feet down as the car sank further and further into the murky depths. As a child, he'd swam in this creek more often than he could count. It had always felt shallow, 10 feet at its absolute deepest, but right now it might as well have been 50. Eli shouted something behind him, but he couldn't hear a word over the blood roaring in his ears. He'd reached the wall and prepared to jump when a figure popped up from the surface. Sophia. Her head crested the water as she gasped a big breath. Chris continued his momentum to jump in and swim as quickly as he could towards the little girl, only turning around to look behind him once he had her in his arms. Sophia, honey, are you okay? She coughed but nodded as he pulled her to shore and handed her up to her brother. Get Mommy and Miss Kayla. They're still down there. I will, honey, Chris said as he prepared to do anything and everything in his power to keep the day from being an absolute tragedy. I will. Chapter 18. Wait, Hannah said as one of the sweet husky mix puppies crawled all over her. So the hand was Chris? Using one of the animal shelter's brushes to relieve one of their long-haired friends of some of her coat, Kayla thought back to that day in the river. It had been a little over a week since the day she and Gloria had both nearly died at Colson River. Chris and Eli had gotten there in time, and he'd managed to pull them both to safety before any permanent damage was done. Lauren sat outside Bruno's cage, tossing treats inside as he stepped closer and closer. After the day she'd brought the women from MVWS here, Harper, Hannah, Sarah, and Felicity had all wanted to spend the day volunteering as well. Brianna had been happy for the help, and Lauren happened to be there as well as she'd come back multiple times since they came. Do they know who was responsible yet? Kayla sighed, shaking her head. There are a couple of different possibilities, but nothing concrete yet. More than likely, it had nothing to do with Drake Thorne and the drug ring Chris had helped bring down in New York. Jace and everyone else was convinced it was Gloria's husband trying to make good on his threats through the years. He'd made bail, but there was nothing they could do to prove it had been him yet. She didn't recognize the truck, but that kind of thing was easy enough to explain. I can only imagine how terrifying that was for you, Lauren said, although Kayla knew good and well the woman had faced the fear of death while she was still married to her ex-husband. You were so lucky Chris got there in time. I don't know if I'd call it luck, Felicity said softly as she rested her head back against the wall. I think the Lord was looking out for you the same way he was that night I hit the end of my rope when Annie was a baby. Lauren's face hardened, and Kayla knew she had her doubts about how much the Lord actually cared about their day-to-day lives. It wasn't that she didn't believe God existed, she didn't understand how a loving God could allow such things to happen to them. That was a fair question, and it was one she'd be working through for a while. Before anyone responded, Lauren's phone trilled in her pocket. With a furrowed brow, she swiped to answer. Hey, Will, are you okay? Wilson and the rest of the kids were at school that day, and if Lauren's wide eyes were any indication, whatever Wilson told her wasn't good.
Oh no.
Is he okay?
Yeah.
I'll let her know. Thanks, honey. Lauren slid her phone back in her pocket, biting her bottom lip as she turned sad eyes on Kayla. Eli's been in another fight, and apparently this time they found marijuana in his locker too. Kids and the gossip chain were far faster than any teacher or administrator could hope to be. Shooting to her feet, Kayla handed the puppy over she'd been petting to Brianna. I'm sorry. I've got to go. Her phone vibrated in her pocket, and she couldn't decide whether she hoped it was Chris or Gloria calling to fill her in. Somehow, the woman hadn't completely shattered after that day at the creek, but her hold on her strength was tenuous at best at the moment. For that matter, hers was too for the moment. Go, Brianna said as she shooed her out. I hope everything's all right. By the time Kayla had gone back to the shelter to pick up Gloria, Chris had indeed called to fill her in on as much as he could. He couldn't give many details over the phone, but she could hear how tortured his voice sounded. As they pulled into the school parking lot, Kayla reached over to take Gloria's hand. It's going to be okay. We're going to get this figured out. I hope you're right. Gloria's shoulders hunched again, and the sight nearly brought Kayla to tears. She couldn't give in. It was important she be strong for Gloria, strong for Chris, and ultimately strong for Eli as well. Whispering a quick prayer everything would indeed be fine, Kayla led the way into the high school and down the hallway to the administrative offices. When they arrived, she found Eli on one side with a split lip, a bruise on his forehead, and bloody knuckles. 3 boys sat on the other side of the office, all in varying states of dishevelment, but none of them as beat up as Eli. Tears flowing down her face, Gloria knelt beside her son's chair and placed her hand on his knee. They whispered quietly to one another in Spanish as Chris stepped out of his office with Principal Templeton in tow. Templeton looked livid, and Chris looked exhausted. Unexpectedly for the middle of his workplace, Chris crossed the office and wrapped Kayla in a quick hug before releasing her and turning to the rest of the boys. "Connor, Daniel, and Jackson, your parents are all on their way. I'm going to take Eli and his mother in the office first dash." Before Chris could finish speaking, the door to the office flew open and a horde of adults flowed in. All immediately went to stand next to the boys on the other side of the office, glaring at both administrators and Eli as well. Clearly, their parents had arrived. One boy had only his father with him, the other 2 had fathers and mothers standing beside them as well. All 5 adults were dressed sharply, in suits as though their positions were important ones. Kayla didn't know any of them, but it wouldn't surprise her if they worked in cities nearby. Connor's father acted as mouthpiece, looking inexplicably familiar as his eyes narrowed at Chris. "Poplar, I told you this kid was trouble and look what you've allowed to happen? Connor said he has drugs on campus, and he picked a fight with our boys." The other parents nodded, but neither Eli nor Gloria spoke. Chris, however, remained calm despite the tension in his shoulders. "Greg, if you'd like to discuss this further in my office, I'd be happy to dash." "No, I think we should discuss it right here. I want everyone to know why you allowed a kid who already tried to jump my son, was picked up for shoplifting, and accused of drug possession was able to lay a hand on him. This was gross negligence on the school's part, and I will be contacting my lawyer about it." Despite the seriousness of the accusations, it was actually Principal Templeton who spoke up. "Fine, you want to have this conversation here, let's do it. I'll be the first to admit I haven't given Eli the benefit of the doubt since he got here, despite the fact he's been dealt a rough hand. I'm sorry for that, Eli," he said earnestly. Eli's eyes widened, hopping from Chris's to Mr. Templeton's quickly. It's okay, Mr. Templeton. It looks bad, I get it. It looks bad, but we've determined that was by design." Facing the man he'd called Greg again, Templeton narrowed his eyes. "Olivia, would you mind coming out here please?" A girl around 14 or 15 stepped out of Chris's office, her long brown hair pulled into some sort of a messy bun atop her head. She wore a reindeer pass lacrosse hoodie and jeans, but Kayla had no doubt this was the girl Chris had told her it all started over. She was very pretty, and she spoke clearly despite her shaking legs. "Yes, Mr. Templeton." With a deep breath, Olivia speared the 3 boys with a glare. "I've had enough, Connor. You did your best to make Eli's life miserable because I moved on. That's over." Impressed with the girl's gumption, Kayla caught Chris's eye. The corner of his lip turned up, her only indication things were about to turn. "Greg," Chris said calmly. "Olivia has shown us evidence not only are your son and his friends responsible for placing the stolen goods in his backpack at the grocery store, they're also the ones who put them in his locker this morning. Boys," he addressed the 3 of them. "Not only do we have cameras in the hallways, but I also had Chief Todd bring in one of his K9 units to do a random check this morning after all this transpired. Any guesses what we found?" All 3 boys' faces drained of color, and Greg sputtered as his face reddened. "Don't beat around the bush, Poplar. What do you think you found?" "We found marijuana in both Connor and Daniel's gym lockers. Jackson didn't have any inside, but the dogs picked up the scent nonetheless. Cameras not only caught you 3 breaking Eli's lock and placing it inside, but we also clearly saw the 3 of you jump him behind the gym. It's a clear-cut case of self-defense, and you did all this over a girl?" Olivia blushed, and Templeton crossed his arms over his chest. "Now, Greg, I imagine you'd like to have the rest of this conversation in private. Am I right? Eli, I'm sorry for everything these boys have put you through, but you're free to go." Your absence is excused for the rest of the day if you'd like to go home and ice that lip. Thank you, Mr. Templeton, Eli said as he stood to his feet. He'd barely done so when Greg crossed the room towards him and Gloria. The room seemed to have all the air sucked out of it as he closed in on Eli. Both Kayla and Chris moved for them, but it was Gloria who stepped around her son and put her hand out to stop Greg's approach. You'll not come anywhere near my son, or you'll have a restraining order on your hands. I lived in fear of a man's moods and inability to control his anger for nearly 2 decades, and I'll be dead in the ground before someone else will make him feel the way his father did. Pride at Gloria's squared shoulders and head held high flowed through Kayla as she moved to stand beside her. Chris had already stopped short of the group, clearly ready to step in if Greg should escalate, but somehow realizing this was something Eli's mother needed to do herself. Greg, Templeton said as he crossed his arms over his chest. If you don't step back in the next 2 seconds, I'll be calling Chief Todd back up here. I don't think it'll look too good for your re-election campaign if you get arrested for threatening a teenage boy, do you? Re-election campaign? Clearly not in Reindeer Pass, but maybe in a neighboring town? Suddenly, it dawned on her why he looked so familiar. Greg Lawson was the state representative from the district next to theirs. They lived in the district of Reindeer Pass schools, but not in the town itself. Just as the boys had when they'd mentioned the drug dogs, Greg's face paled as he stepped back. His hands raised in surrender, Greg took 3 large steps back until he reached his son's side once more. Fine.
Yeah.
We'll go talk in your office. It was nearly an hour later when Chris finally followed Greg, Connor, Daniel, Jackson, and the rest of the parents out of his office. Templeton had expelled the boys, as was expected, and not a single one of the parents had believed the punishment to fit the crime. How they possibly came to that conclusion with all the boys had done, and over a girl no less, baffled him. Chris ran a hand over his face only to hear Kayla clear her throat as she stood from the bench outside the administrative offices. You're still here. He was happy about it, but she'd waited so long. Figured you'd need a hug when it was all said and done. She shrugged, her cheeks pinking a little as he closed the distance between them. Everyone can use a hug after a hard day. Needing exactly that, but a little confused as to the logistics, Chris pulled Kayla into his arms. Where are Gloria and Eli? I called Rhonda to come pick them up. Pretty sure she took them to lunch, Kayla said with a chuckle. I knew you'd probably have a tough time no matter how the meeting played out, and I wanted to be here to support you. She was the blessing he'd had no idea he needed. I can't believe we finally got to the bottom of all this. Eli was so patient, always doing exactly what he needed to throughout it all. Did they admit to the rest of it? I know you have video proof about the fight and the marijuana. They did. I'm not sure why they were smart enough to avoid the cameras at the grocery store but didn't think to avoid them here. Either way, it worked to our benefit that their teenage brains are still pretty undercooked. He chuckled, though it lacked any real amusement. Regardless of what they'd done, the boys had altered the course of their lives. Neither he nor Principal Templeton ever enjoyed an expulsion. Do you think Connor's dad will sue the school for expelling him? He may try, but he'll be wasting his money. The school board has a legal team to defend us, and I'm sure his bill's hourly. It'll be annoying and frustrating, but ultimately it's a pretty open and shut case. With a long sigh, Chris allowed himself to stand with Kayla for a moment longer before releasing her. I hate that I have to go. It's almost lunchtime, and I need to make myself visible in the courtyard. It was amazing how the presence of a teacher or administrator would often keep things under control. Templeton had taught him that early in his career, and he'd done his best to follow the guidance every time it was possible. Not to mention, it helped him get to know the students, their friend groups, and what kids didn't seem to fit anywhere. Kayla nodded, standing up on her tiptoes to press a kiss to his cheek. I'm going to get Gloria and Eli big cookies from the bakery. I'm so proud of her, and he deserves it after all he's been through. The bright spot of the day had been Gloria finding her backbone to stand up against Greg in the face of all the trauma she'd faced. They still had questions about the car accident, but Chris's gut told him it was Gloria's ex in a different car than the one she'd recognize rather than anyone related to Drake Thorne. Jace and his team were doing their best to locate Mr. Santos, but for the moment, he was in the wind. "Get one for yourself too," he said softly. "I'll come by the shelter later and check on Eli if that's okay. If he feels like it, maybe we can shoot some baskets to take his mind off things." Kayla grinned, and he knew he'd spend the rest of his life trying to make her do so. Sounds like a plan. Chapter 19. The door to the shelter burst open as Eli sprinted through it. Lauren, her boys, and Sophia all followed behind him with wide grins. Gloria had gone to testify before the judge regarding her husband's abuse, as the law had finally caught up with him. Turned out, he'd been on record for renting a truck matching the description from the accident and returned it with a dent shoddily hammered out of the front bumper. Between that and the documentation they had of Gloria's wounds from when she came to MVWS, it had been enough to have the judge revoke his bail until he would stand trial later that summer. They still had a good deal to sort out, but Jefferson's brother was a lawyer in Bozeman who decided to take the case pro bono to keep Gloria from incurring any unnecessary expenses in the process of hopefully putting Mr. Santos behind bars. "Mom." Eli's gleeful expression was matched by the rest of them filing through the front door, and Kayla didn't even have the heart to tell him to stop dribbling the basketball through the entryway. "Miss Kayla, where's Mom?" "I'm right here, buddy," Gloria said from the couch where she sat crocheting with Francis, her new baby fast asleep in the swing beside them. Placing her things aside, she stood and approached Eli. "I take it this is good news?" Looking every bit the 14-year-old he was rather than the man he'd been forced to become, Eli's head bobbed up and down as his whole body vibrated with excitement. "I made the team. Coach put up the roster today, and I'm on the JV team for next year." He sobered for a moment, placing his hand on his mother's shoulder. "I asked Mr. Poplar if I could work extra at the ranch this summer to pay for my uniforms and equipment and stuff, so you don't have to worry about it." Gloria bit her lip, and Kayla could see the equal parts pride and grief as she pulled him into a hug. "You don't have to worry about that, buddy. We'll figure it out." She would. Over the last few weeks, not only had Gloria applied and been accepted to the cosmetology school in Coopertown, she'd also managed to get a job behind the desk at the salon in town working part-time until she finished her certification. "I'm so proud of you." Laying his head on his mother's shoulder despite his being several inches taller than her, Eli sighed. "I can't believe it." "I can," a familiar voice sounded as Chris stepped through the still-open front door. "Coach Brown told me he was really impressed with your ball handling skills and fundamentals. He's looking forward to coaching you this year, and the other boys on the team are a good group for you to get to know." Eli pulled loose from his mother's hug and turned to face Chris. "Thanks, Mr. Poplar. For everything." He stuck out his hand for a shake, only for Chris to take it and pull him into one of those bro hugs where they pat each other on the back. Kayla could have sworn she saw the kid's chest visibly puff out at the show of respect from the man he so admired. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't, buddy. Now, I know I probably should have asked permission first, but I stopped on the way over and got stuff for ice cream sundaes to celebrate." He grinned guiltily at Kayla before winking. "If it's okay, with the boss, that is." "I don't know," she said as she closed the distance between them and wrapped her arms around his middle. "Did you bring moose tracks?" Chris's brow raised. "Is that your favorite, Miss Mitchell?" "Obviously. It's the superior flavor." She could eat the eggs in processed ice cream for some reason, but her allergy was weird and sometimes an unexpected animal to navigate. If it meant she got ice cream and cupcakes on occasion, she wouldn't question it. With sprinkles, of course. Noted. Chris took her hand and led her outside to his truck where he opened the passenger door to at least 6 tubs of ice cream and bags of toppings. "Moose tracks, coming right up. Extra sprinkles, too. No eggs." He was still in his button-down shirt and tie from the day at school, but he'd loosened the latter in a casual look that made him even more handsome somehow. "I wanted to celebrate Eli's making the basketball team, but I had something else to celebrate as well." "Oh."
Yeah.
Chris's previously jovial expression had sombered some, but it held more peace than she'd ever seen on him.
"Yeah.
"Got a call from my contact in Washington about Drake Thorne." He was killed by a rival of some sort in the organized crime world. Both of his brothers have been arrested for crimes related to the situation, but nothing to do with me. I'm never happy to know someone who didn't know the Lord died, but I am relieved it's all over. Of course, you are, Kayla said as she wrapped her arms around him again. You're free to live the life you want to live. A soft breeze rustled through the May air as Chris smoothed back a flyaway lock from her face. You can live again. Chris returned the embrace with one arm while tipping her chin up with the other. I know exactly how I want to do it. Before Kayla could respond, he pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that would have made her knees turn to jelly if he hadn't been holding her up. It had been a long road to get them there, but they'd finally arrived to the place they were supposed to be all along. Thank you for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my channel and leave a comment if you enjoyed Hearts at War. Be sure to check out my other series playlists while you wait for the next book in the Mountain Promise series.